Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's very special debate. The format of this debate is going to be a little funny, where after the fact, after today's live stream, I will clip in our opening statements, which we have already completed and sent to each other. But without further ado, Matthew, welcome to the Conversations with Catholics debate show. How you doing?
Yeah, hi Kevin. Thank you for inviting me on your channel. It's nice to talk with people who know a bit about Catholicism and who have been in contact with Catholics. I know you used to be a Catholic, so it's very interesting to have these kinds of conversations with you, with skeptics, with everyone's about new recent miracles. And I think this should be more ongoing in the public debate. Too often, I find that philosophers of religion only focus on philosophical arguments, cosmological arguments, things like that. But I think it's also good to dig deep in the mud and go and see if there are well attested miracles in history. And this is why we wanted to talk about this theme of Eucharistic miracles, which is not often debated on YouTube. So yeah.
100% agreed. I'm an engineer by education, so I love the sciences and the empirical process and all of that. And it does seem like it's an understudied, under discussed, underappreciated kind of niche within the Catholic world. Using science and not just kind of armchair philosophy. So I'm very grateful to you, to Dr. Serafini, and to people like Dr. Trasankos, Dr. Kears, and people like Dr. Linoli, for doing all of this work and bringing this to the public. Without yours included, without yours and their efforts here, conversations like this would not be happening. So I'm very grateful to you and to everybody else that I mentioned, because without them, this conversation would not be possible. Speaking of this conversation, I am going to go ahead and insert after the fact our opening statements right now.
Hi everyone. In this presentation, I want to talk to you about Eucharistic miracles, which I consider to be a solid argument in favor of Catholicism. So first, let's start with a definition. A Eucharistic miracle refers to a supernatural event occurring with a consecrated host, most often characterized by the transformation of that host into human flesh. Given the extraordinary nature of this claim, a skeptic may legitimately wonder, did these miracles really happen? How can we be sure it's not a hoax? These questions are entirely valid. One should not be credulous when faced with such events. So I think we have to distinguish between good skepticism on one hand and bad skepticism on the other hand. So what do I mean by that? Good skepticism, to me, means not believing things without good evidence and demanding serious evidence to confirm that a miracle has happened. Bad skepticism, on the other hand, would be to say things like miracles are impossible, no matter the amount of evidence, I will never believe in them. I think that's bad, and that a good investigator must strive to begin his inquiry without preconceived ideas, without naturalistic biases. So the problem is that many atheists on internet start from the conclusion that God does not exist and that Christianity cannot be true, and from there they conclude that Eucharistic miracles must necessarily be false without even beginning the investigation. And of course, this is not only on the atheist side. This bias exists also amongst certain believers who tend to see miracles everywhere because they are already convinced of the truth of Christianity. So I think the rational approach must be neutral from the outset before any investigation begins. So we should not presume the miracle is true, certainly, but neither should we presume it is impossible for it to be true. Only the evidence matters, and it must be examined rigorously, and one must be willing to be objectively convinced by the best arguments. And I hope that skeptics acting in good faith will agree with me on this. So, what if Eucharistic miracles were false? So, if Eucharistic miracles were false, I think it would not change anything about the Christian faith. The central reason why Catholics believe in the real presence of Jesus in the host is because Jesus taught it. You can see, for example, John 6:48 to 58, the discourse on the bread of life, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has life in him. Indeed, my flesh is true food and my blood is true drink. And so Jesus has taught his real presence in the consecrated bread. And throughout history, the first Christians, up until the Protestant Reformed, believed in the real presence. I have a detailed video on this subject on my YouTube channel in French if you're interested with that theme. So, but it's not the subject of today. Just to say that that's the central reason why we Catholics believe in the real presence. It's because Jesus taught it, and Jesus is a credible teacher. However, if at least some Eucharistic miracles are true, then they provide a strong case in favor, confirming what Christ said. So it would bolster the case for the real presence. And so this is why there's a genuine interest in studying these phenomena from a rational and scientific perspective. Because if they are true, then they would serve as a good confirmation of the Catholic faith. Okay, so from a historical standpoint, there have been 136 documented accounts of Eucharistic miracles throughout history. The guy who documented all of these is called Carlo Acutis. He's soon going to be canonized by the Catholic Church. His body is incorruptible. Here you can see it on the screen. And he wrote a book where he investigated historically all these miracle reports throughout history, and he's counted approximately 136. So he died in 2006. Since 2006, there have been others miracles reported, especially the ones I will show in this presentation. But just to say that the phenomenon of Eucharistic miracles has happened throughout history without interruption. It's not something we invented in the 20th century, for instance. So that's from a historical standpoint. Of course, we won't be able to analyze the 136 cases. That would take way too long. But in this presentation, I want to take a look at 5 cases analyzed by science. And for that, I will be using Franco Serafini's book, A Cardiologist Examines Jesus. So I recommend everyone to buy this book. This is probably the best book that has ever been written on Eucharistic miracles from a scientific perspective. So I really encourage everyone to buy it. So let's start with the first case. The first case is Lanciano. Lanciano is a city in Italy. In the 8th century, approximately towards the year 750, there has been a report that a priest who did not believe in the real presence of Christ, who had some doubts on the subject, during a mass, after the consecration, the host turned into flesh and blood, and he showed it to the entire church. Everyone was screaming it was a miracle, and this beautiful sign has been kept in Lanciano since then. You can see it still today. And so in 1970, the scientific analysis wanted to confirm if it was or not a miracle. And so Dr. Edoardo Linoli, who is a professor of anatomy, histology, and clinical microscopy, and who was also the head of service at the hospital of Arezzo in Italy, was called by the Vatican and the Franciscan friars to start his investigation on November 18, 1970. And so he took some samples and went to his laboratory to study what this was from a scientific perspective. And so this article can be found on PubMed. So PubMed, for those who don't know, it's an international library of medicine where doctors, specialists, scientists publish articles on their findings and share it with the international community. And so if you type Linoli on this PubMed, you will find the scientific article he wrote after studying the case of Lanciano. So it's public. And here's the official source. The primary source is in Italian because Linoli was Italian. And his conclusion that I translated in English, published in 1971, said the following thing. Firstly, the miraculous flesh is real human flesh composed of striated muscle tissue from the myocardium. So the myocardium, for those who don't know, is a part of the heart. It's a specific part of the human heart. Secondly, the miraculous blood that they found in Lanciano, in the relic of Lanciano, was shown to be real human blood, and this was shown through the chromatographic analysis. And thirdly, immunological studies showed that both the flesh and the blood were not only of human nature, but also belong to the group AB. both the flesh and the blood. And we will see later that AB is the rarest blood group on Earth. Fourthly, the proteins in the blood were normally distributed just like in fresh normal blood. So Linoli could compare the proteins in normal blood and the proteins that they found in the blood of Lanciano. And Linoli found no histological section that revealed any trace of preservatives previously used for embalming. So nothing was used to preserve the host throughout the years, because this was a host from the Middle Ages, and there was no thing that to preserve it like they do with Egyptian mummies. And so here is the summary that Linoli wrote. It's translated in French, and you have pictures on the right showing the nature of the flesh. So these are in black and white. It's 1970, so it's old techniques, but you could still see the parts of the flesh. And what's very impressive is the preservation of the host. So the fact that the host has been kept in a vessel for hundreds of years does not explain its preservation. This vessel did not block air or bacteria. And so one would expect to find a decayed piece of bread, but that's not the case. And Linoli, when I talked about the percentages compared to normal blood and the blood of Lanciano, well, here's the graph showing it. You have the normal values on the right and the values of albumin, globulin, etc. On the left, and you see it almost perfectly matches in many cases. And so this was very rigorous on part of Linoli to do these percentages to compare it to true human blood. And here there's 10 samples with the average you can find for the percentage of calcium, magnesium, and other molecules. And here you have the pictures of the official scientific studies. And you can see on the right, on the bottom right, that there is the scientific article published, and there is the images, the iconographia of Lanciano with the pictures taken by Linoli. So, I mean, it was 1970, but it's still pretty rigorous work for science at the time. And here are other pictures of the flesh, where you can see the details of the sample. And Linoli was not alone in this. So there's a false rumor saying that, well, Linoli was alone in this investigation. That's actually not true, because his results were confirmed by an associate emeritus professor of anatomy at the University of Siena, who is named Ruggero Bertelli. That is what Linoli says in 1971. I must add that this opinion, so the opinion in question is the scientific study, is shared by Professor Ruggero Bertelli, Emeritus Professor of Human Anatomy at the University of Siena. The histological aspects detected in the tissue, although altered by time, are absolutely objective and reliable. So that's what Linoli says in 1971, and the proof of that is on the left. You have the letter signed by Ruggero Bertelli. It's signed on 27th February 1971, and if you read Italian, you will see that Bertelli confirms the scientific results of Linoli. And few people know that there was a second test done on Lanciano in 1981, so 10 years later, because the Franciscan required a new analysis on unused sampled from 1970, so other samples that had not been used in the previous analysis in 1970. And the findings once again confirmed that it was human heart tissue, myocardic tissue. Linoli observed myocardial fibrocellular structure, the inner membrane of the heart, so the endocardium, and he also saw blood vessels. So this is amazing. We have a host that is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old that has not been preserved. And when you look at the microscope, you find the inner membrane of the heart, and you see the blood vessels appearing on a piece of bread. So that's intrinsically supernatural in nature. According to Linoli, the flesh had undergone cadaveric rigidity, which means that it was alive at the moment the miracle occurred. And Serafini explains why cadaveric rigidity implies that the sample was alive at the moment it was collected in his book, if you're interested. So here you have pictures of the myocard, the endocard, and other tissues from the heart. And Linoli said it was probably from the left ventricle. So it's very the analysis of 1970 was pretty rigorous for the time. So in conclusion, I would say that the Lanciano case is a scientifically solid case. Linoli's approach was rigorous. he included samples to ensure the validity of the results, so control samples. He was an honest scientist who did not hide the challenge he encountered. Some tests were negative, and he mentioned it in his scientific paper, showing he was an honest scientist trying to do his job rigorously. His analyses were published in a reputable scientific journal. As we said, it's available on PubMed, and it was confirmed by another professor, Ruggero Bertelli, as we saw, and in another analysis on another distinct sample in 1981. So, some people object that the first historical document is late. It dates from the 16th century, and so historically it's not a very solid case. I would say, sure, the first document we have dates from the 16th century, but that doesn't matter for the miracle in question, because we know where the host is from the 16th century onwards, and we know that the host has been preserved for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in Lanciano, and so even if the miracle occurred like in the 1500s instead of the Middle Ages, like in the 700s, that doesn't change much. We have a very well preserved host, and the scientific analysis of Linoli confirms this miracle independently of the historical questions which can be put aside. So now let's go to a second case, the case of Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires had many miracles, actually 5 of them, that occurred in 1992, 1994, and 1996 in this little church, the same little church, St. Mary's Church in Buenos Aires. And so the first miracle occurred in 1992. And so during Mass, a host started bleeding, and it was sent to scientific studies. The doctor in question who studied it was Dr. Sazot, who was an expert in this domain, and she published the leukocyte formula showing the percentages of monocytes, lymphocytes, basophil, etc. So this is in French, but you get the idea. You have the values from the miracle of the 1st of May 1992, the 10th of May 1992, and compared to the normal values you find in human blood. And you can see that pretty much it fits the normal values you have in human blood. And the only difference is that there's an excess in lymphocytes. And so this excess in lymphocytes show that the patient must have suffered a severe trauma, as Serafini explains in his book. He goes into the scientific details of why the excess of lymphocytes shows this trauma on the patients. But if you compare both the 1st May and 10th May miracle, it looks like it's pretty much the same person, right? So the almost same number of percentages for lymphocytes, that's very impressive. And so here is the final report, the primary source, published by Dr. Sazot. It is signed on the October 29th, 1995, and you have the report in Spanish here if you want to pause the video and read the report. This was the official document. But the miracle of Buenos Aires is most known for the miracle of 1996, which happened in the same church. So it was on August 1996, a host fell during Mass, and it was placed into a pot of water and put in a tabernacle. That's the official Catholic procedure. And 1 week later, on August 26th, the priest went back to open the tabernacle, and he found the host stained in red. So you can see the picture on the right on August 26, 1996. Here's what the host looks like. And so the Father Alejandro Perret, the priest, informed Bishop Bergoglio, the bishop of the diocese, who would end up becoming Pope Francis. And so after a month of waiting, the host was placed in distilled water and remained there for 3 years. And it's only in July 1999 that Bishop Bergoglio finally authorized scientific analysis of the piece of Eucharist. And Dr. Castañón Gomez, a former atheist who converted to Catholicism because he studied Catholic miracles, he's an expert in biochemistry, neurophysiology, and he began his investigation on September 28, 1999, with the bishop's approval. And so he's helped by two other guys. There's Ron Tesoriero, who's an Australian lawyer, and Mike Wilsey, who is a television presentator from Australia too. So these three, they're not the scientists, of course. It's not them who do the scientific studies, but they take the samples to give it to different scientists. And so here is the day they took these samples. So this was on October 5th, 1999. You can see the pictures on the screen. It was all filmed by Ron Tesoriero's camera, so it was very rigorous. We could see everything they did from the moment they took it to the moment they put it in the sample. So the little bottle on the right bottom, and you see it's not the sample is not named. You just have 26 de Augusto 1996 and 5 October 1999. And so that's just the date of the sample. Did not mention the name of the sample because they would end up showing it to many different scientists without telling them the origin of the host. And so they first send it to the Forensic Analytical Lab in California, which tries to do a DNA test, and they could recover a low concentration of human DNA, but the PCR and STR analysis was attempted, but no results were obtained. So the sample does not normally react to the genetic code test that they usually do. So that was something that was weird. So no genetic profile could be established. But then the team, Castagnon Gomez team with Tesoriero and Mike Wilsey, wanted to know if we could see what was this sample in reality, even if we could not detect DNA. And so they went to see Dr. Lawrence in 2000, and they filmed him December 7th. You can find the video on internet. And Dr. Lawrence says face camera that he sees white blood cells that are alive. And this is normally impossible because the host had been kept in distilled water for over 3 years. And distilled water, as you know, is a water without minerals or salts, which is normally hostile to life. And yet, Dr. Lawrence sees face camera. White cells being alive. So you can see on his screen on the bottom right, he points to the white cells. And here there are other pictures of the white cells that Dr. Lawrence can see on the microscope. All of this is filmed. You can find it on the channel Reason to Believe. You can see Dr. Lawrence live reaction. And so this is pretty much amazing that the white cells are still here 3 years after. And while refining their investigation, Dr. Gomez's team continued to show the samples to several other scientists in the subsequent month and years. In Australia, they go see Dr. Peter Ellis from the University of Sydney, Dr. Thomas Loy, Dr. John Walker from Sydney, and they also asked for Professor Linoli's opinion, who studied the host from Lanciano. He was also asked what he thought about it. So on the right, you can see he looks at the pictures of the sample. He did not look at it under the microscope, but he still had the microscopic pictures taken. And according to him, it looked like heart muscle. But the team wanted to have a final conclusion to be definitive, and therefore they turned to Professor Frederick Zugibe, who was the chief medical examiner and cardiologist at the time at Columbia University in New York. And so why him? Well, because he was perhaps the world leading expert in cardiology at the time, and he had 30 years of experience, numerous scientific publications, and over 10,000 autopsies to his name. So he was really a world expert in his domain, and that's why they went to him. So they sent him a picture by email. See the picture on the top. They say, "Dear Dr. Zugibe, can we have a meeting so that you can tell us what this is?" And so Dr. Zugibe said yes, and they met on April 20th, 2004. Tesoriero was filming the meeting, and Wilsey was interviewing Zugibe. And so Zugibe did not know where the sample came from. He just had this sample shown to him with the date of the sample, but no identification of the sample. So we could call it blind testing. And if you want to see Zugibe's reaction to this, go to Reason to Believe, and you can see at 8 minutes his reaction, his live reaction under the microscope, where he comments what he's seeing. And so this is what he's seeing under the microscope, and directly states, while looking at it under the microscope, "I am a heart expert. The heart is my business. This is flesh. This flesh is heart muscle tissue, myocardium from the left ventricle, not far from a valvular area. It is the muscle that gives the heart its beat and the body its life. This heart muscle is inflamed, it has lost its striation, and is infiltrated with white blood cells. White blood cells are not normally found in heart tissue. These cells are produced by the body and they escape from blood and infiltrate the tissue to address trauma or injury. The heart of the person from which this tissue has come has been injured and has suffered trauma. The blood supplies to this heart has been compromised, resulting in necrosis, the destruction of part of the heart muscle. This heart has suffered. This is not unlike what I see in motor vehicle accident cases when CPR is applied to a person too harshly and the heart suffers injury. It is also the sort of suffering that I see in cases where someone has been severely beaten around the chest. And so, of course, this is very impressive because what he says here looks like the Passion of Christ, what Christ had suffered, suffering hearts beaten around the chest. And so that's very impressive. And he says that without even knowing where the sample comes from. And so Mike then asks Zugibe, and the white blood cells, what do they indicate? And Zugibe responds, they indicate injury and inflammation. There are many, they are all intact. White blood cells can exist only if they are nourished by the body. This heart was alive at the moment the sample was taken. And Ron further asks, how long would these cells remain alive if placed in a human tissue kept in water? And Zugibe responds, white blood cells cannot exist outside the body because they are nourished by it. White blood cells normally disintegrate after a few minutes or at most a few hours after removal. And so that's very impressive because the host had been in water for 8 years now. We're in 2004 and the miracle occurred in 1996. And so it's 8 years later, and Zugibe still sees the white blood cells that are alive under the microscope. And that's very, very impressive. And here on March 26, 2005, so almost a year later, Frederick Zugibe signs a letter confirming the analysis he saw on the microscope. And he even says on the letter, I was not informed of the history of the material. And so he's saying basically that they did not tell him the origin of the material. And so this is what we can call blind testing. Finally, they gave these results to Archbishop Bergoglio in 2006, where they met March 17, 2006. And here are the results, the official results that are published, and that's the Cardinal Bergoglio approved. So you can put pause and read these results in Spanish if you want. Okay, now let's go to Tixla. Tixla, so we're in 2006 now, 22 October 2006. So here's a quick summary of the facts. So more than 600 people were participating in a weekend, a spiritual retreat with two priests, Leopold Roque and Father Raito. Two nuns were helping to distribute the communion. Suddenly, Sister Areli Marokin, one of the two nuns, turned pale and rushed back towards the altar in tears. And why? Because she showed Father Raito in the ciborium that a host had become suddenly stained with blood. So you can see the host stained with blood on the pictures on the right here. And Father Raito saw it and he exclaimed out loud, oh, it's a miracle. And he showed the congregation the host. And so here are more clear pictures of the Tixla miracle, filmed on the day it happened. And in the following weeks, Bishop Alejo Zavala Castro, who was the bishop of the diocese at the time, decides to set up a commission of inquiry. And it is based firstly on 17 sworn testimony made by different people, all in agreement, who said they saw the miracle in the church. And 3 years later, the scientific investigation was launched by Ricardo Castañón Gomez and his association, Grupo Internacional para la Paz, because they pay for the scientific investigations. Dr. Castañón described the bishop as someone who is very balanced, not naive, but also somewhat skeptical. So this rejoins what I said about good skepticism in the beginning of this presentation. He does not want to believe the miracle without evidence, but he's somewhat skeptical, but he's willing to go ahead and try this scientific investigations. And so while he remained open to a supernatural explanation, he was in no rush to recognize the miracle in his diocese, and his main concern was to establish the factual reality of what had happened. And so on October 27, 2009, Dr. Castagnon collected 3 samples of the host, and his association then turned to various specialized laboratories in forensic medicine, immunochemistry, and genetics in Mexico, in Bolivia, Guatemala, and in the USA. And each time, the result was repeatedly and independently confirmed by different researchers under blind conditions, meaning without telling the origin of the samples. And so you could see the presentation of the results, the official presentation, in a conference that was held on May 25th, 2013. You can find it on YouTube. Here is the video in question. It's in Spanish, so I don't speak Spanish, but for those of you who speak Spanish, you can go watch it. So here's the summary of the findings. First of all, they found human blood on the host, so not a big surprise when you see the picture. So it's human blood. The sample corresponded to a heart muscle suffering trauma or a heart attack. And Dr. Blanquet Anya, the cardiologist at the Nuevo Hospital in Colombia, stated that the person to whom the heart belonged had undergone a heart attack or significant physiological stress. And the laboratory GeneX in La Paz in Bolivia notably confirmed the presence of hemoglobin, a protein found only in red blood cells. And finally, the blood group was AB, the same as the one on the host of Lanciano, and this was confirmed by 2 separate laboratories. One is the Corporativo Médico Legal in Mexico, and the second is the GeneX laboratory in Bolivia, and both demonstrated through immunohistofluorescence the presence of the antigens A and B in the examined tissues. And finally, the GeneX laboratory also determined for the first time the RH, the negativity of the RH of the sample. And so this is the first time it happened in the Eucharistic miracles. And so here is the official document, the primary source from the GeneX laboratory in Bolivia. It dates from 2010, and you can see the results AB RH negative. And finally, here's the primary source for the full reports. So it's 4 pages long, but it was published on PatMed, and you guys can see that it's a rigorous scientific study based on pictures and different independent doctors. And what's very impressive about the Tixla case is that they could show that the blood came from inside the host. So 2 separate studies following different methods showed that the human blood in question came from within the host. So first one in 2009 with Dr. Lazo, and in 2010 with Dr. Perez, especially in February 2010, so that 4 years after the miracles, Dr. Rodriguez Perez, who is a digital imaging expert, came to Tixla with a high-powered digital microscope, and he demonstrated the ongoing presence of the fresh blood in the stained portion of the host underneath the coagulum. And so this shows that it was not placed there by a fraudster because it came from within the host itself. And so, furthermore, they could also show that the white blood cells were alive on the host 3 years after the fact. So in 2009, 3 years after, the white blood cells were still alive. And that's very impressive because that's exactly what we saw in Buenos Aires. Now this is confirmed for Tixla. The exact same scenario has happened in another country with different scientists, different laboratories in blind testing. So it's very, very impressive. And one of these cells called a macrophage was observed under the microscope eating fatty debris. So here's the picture of the macrophage that was captured on the microscope. It's pretty big, but yeah, that's to show that the scientific analysis were pretty rigorous in the case of Tixla. They could see such details. So in conclusion, I could say that the conclusions for Tixla are much the same as for the Buenos Aires case, and I would say they're just as impressive, even if not more, because they were made by different scientific laboratories under blinded conditions, adding additional strong testimony to the reality of these Eucharistic miracles. Okay, so now let me talk to you about Sokolka. Sokolka is another independent Eucharistic miracle that occurred in Poland on October 12th, 2008. So this was during a mass, 8:30 mass in the morning in the Church of Saint Anthony of Padua with Father Filip Zadrowski, who dropped a host without noticing. And he picked it up, but since it was dirty, he followed the standard procedure in the Catholic Church and placed it in a bowl of water. And then in the tabernacle to wait until it dissolved. But when they came back a week later on Sunday, October 19th at 8 a.m., the sacristan Julian Dubowska opened the tabernacle and found that the host was partially covered by a red-colored um, and found that the host was partially covered by a red substance, a coagulum-like substance. And so Sister Julia immediately called the priest in charge of the church, and the bishop was quickly informed and asked for the host to be secured. On January 7, 2009, so just a few months later, at the bishop's request, the host was removed from the white linen for further examination. And so you can see that the host was put on this cloth, the white cloth, and they took it off this white cloth and sent it to two experts. So these two experts come from the Bialystok University, and they were chosen to perform the examination. First, we have Stanislaw Sulowski, who is a renowned professor from the Department of General Pathomorphology. He has 286 publications recognized by PubMed, and he is an expert in immunohistochemistry of neoplastic tissues. Maria Zobaniak-Lotowska from the Department of Medical Pathomorphology also has 115 scientific publications on PubMed, and her main expertise lies in hepatology and pediatric gastroenterology. So we have two worldwide experts who are chosen to study this Eucharistic miracle. Maria Zobaniak-Lotowska knew that it came from a consecrated host because she was there when they took it from the host, but the professor Stanislaw Sulowski does not know anything of that, so he's doing totally a blind testing. And so both examined it independently in different rooms, and so they both came with the same conclusion that it is heart muscle, or at least a living organic structure that mostly resembles heart tissue, heart muscle. And they found that the fibers show centrally placed nuclei with segments and delicate microfibrillar formations with disintegration that showed a sign of suffering or damage. So a suffering myocardic tissue. And especially it was impossible to fake. So the heart muscle fibers and the substance of the host were intrinsically intertwined. So you can see on the pictures on the screen here that the degree of microscopic interpenetration cannot be manufactured by any kind of human instruments because you have the substance of the host that is intrinsically linked to the myocardic tissue. And so you cannot make these two linked with human instruments. So that's what convinced Dr. Lotowska that it was supernatural. Finally, the last Eucharistic miracle happened in 2013 in Poland, and so you have basically the same scenario that occurs. The host is put in water, and then it starts to turn red. They take up the part that is red, and then they send it to different laboratories. So Dr. Barbara Engel, who was the head of cardiology in Legnica, and was also a member of the study commission set up by the Bishop Chichi, explained that 15 samples were taken from the host in presence of numerous witnesses. So this time it's 15 samples, it's huge. And there were control samples who were also used and prepared from non-consecrated hosts taken from the same production batch. And so they did very rigorous studies with controlled non-consecrated hosts. And they sent it to two different universities. And after that, they explained the results. So the summary of the analysis is that the microscopic examination revealed heart muscle with clear signs of fragmentation and suffering. The image closely resembled those previously documented in Sokolka, as you can see on the screen. They did immunohistochemical testing that also revealed traces of human nuclear and mitochondrial DNA sufficient to document the human origin, even though they could not give a genetic code. Finally, the histopathology department of the Faculty of Medicine of Pomerania announced that the striated muscle of fiber fragments in cross sections were discovered in the histopathological images of the tissue samples, and that it strongly resembled the human heart muscle with the presence of alteration frequently observed in cases of agony. So again, we have a heart muscle tissue from the myocardic tissue that is agonizing, and that's very impressive. So here are some pictures of myocardic fibers with fragmentation phenomenon. So this explains why it's a suffering heart. Here are two different pictures, as you can see. That's what they could see under the microscope. And I want to say a quick word about the blood group. So in French, you say groupe sanguin, but I meant to say blood group. We saw that every time it was AB. But AB is the rarest group on Earth. If you look at the frequency of blood in world population, the most common blood is blood type O, then type A, then type B, and then finally AB. And if you look at AB on the screen, the probability to be AB is a 1 to 5% chance. So, I mean, 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 20. So it's very, very improbable to be that is AB. And when you do some blood testing on other tissues from the past, like Egyptian mummies, you see that it's often not AB. It's group A, group B. They even did a study a few years ago on 54 Egyptian mummies discovered in Chile, and they could show a high prevalence of blood group O and a single case of group A. And here's another independent studies of 14 Egyptian mummies. When they do the blood testing, the group testing, they find it's pretty much O, B, A, B. There's only one AB on the screen, so it's very rare to have some AB group testing. And when you look at the Christian relics, the Shroud of Turin, the Suerdom of Oviedo, and the Tunic of Argenteuil, and the two miracles of Lanciano and Tixla. So you see on the screen, there's 5 independent objects: Lanciano, Tixla, Shroud of Turin, Suerdom of Oviedo, and Tunic of Argenteuil. Every time we did blood testing on these tissues, we always found AB, 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 AB. 15 different tests. So you can see all the tests that were done on the screen and the year it was performed. Also the method, it was not always the same method. Some people object by saying Lanciano is old, it was in the 1970s, they use absorption elution, but that's not the only method that was used in all of the 5 relics. As you can see on screen, they use immunofluorescence, mixed agglutination, absorption inhibition, flow cyclometry, and reverse grouping. So these are independent type of testing methods, and they always come with the same results, AB. So that's very impressive. And when you look at, as I said, at what they did with Egyptian mummies, you almost never find AB. So that in itself is a very powerful argument for the supernatural reality of these tissues. Because the probability of obtaining 5 samples in a row with AB by pure chance is 1 out of 20 to the power of 5, and that's 1 to the power of 3,200,000, which is very microscopic. Compared to this, the probability of being struck by lightning is 1 in 15,300, according to American statistics. There's also an interesting detail in Tixla. We saw the RH was negative, and that further reduces the probability of the fraud. Serafini says that 15% of people on Earth are RH negative. That reduces to the probability of 1 in 133 just for Tixla. And so, yeah, that's pretty impressive. And yeah, we could say that this in itself is an argument for the supernatural reality of these tissues. The possibility of finding 5 times in a row AB, 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 that's very improbable, especially at the time. No one knew the existence of blood groups, putting Tixla apart. At the time of Lanciano, the Shroud of Turin, the Suerdom of Oviedo, the Argenteuil tunic, no one knew the existence of blood groups because that was discovered in 1902. So no one in the Middle Ages could try to find someone with AB blood to put it deliberately on the host of Lanciano, on the Shroud of Turin, on the tunic of Argenteuil and the Suerdom of Oviedo, because at the time no one knew the existence of different blood groups. So that would be in principle not possible to do. And so let me say a last word about DNA. DNA, as we said before, they saw that it was human DNA, a very low concentration, but they could not give a detailed genetic code because the PCR and STR analysis were attempted, but they failed. No results were obtained, and it's the same for Tixla. And so you have no results for the genetic code. And so here's what you obtain for Tixla. On the left, you have a normal profile, genetic code profile. On the right, you obtain something that is totally unreadable. This is totally unreadable, and so it's like if the DNA didn't want to let itself be read by the test. And so, from a theological perspective, Christians can explain that by saying that God doesn't want to reveal too much, doesn't want to reveal Christ's DNA. Because if he were to reveal Christ's DNA, maybe maybe that would be dangerous. Maybe people would try to start cloning Jesus Christ. If you have access to Christ's DNA, people might try to start cloning Christ. And God doesn't want to be overwhelming in his revelation. And so perhaps that's a theological explanation why God doesn't want to reveal the DNA of Christ. But I'll have more to say about this specific test when I analyze the fraud hypothesis, as you will see. Now, let's give a general scientific summary of all the Eucharistic miracles that have been studied by science. So we can say that in the case of Lanciano, Buenos Aires, Sokolka, Tixla, Legnica, each time, 5 times out of 5, it turned out that it was heart muscle tissue, a suffering heart. Um, and whenever the blood group was investigated, it was always, always, always AB, which is the rarest group on Earth. That in itself is sufficient to establish the supernatural aspects of these miracles, any of these two elements. Even though the DNA is present, but the genetic code is unreadable and the samples do not react normally to standard STR testing. Perhaps, as I said, is God wants to stay hidden on this and not reveal too much, not reveal Christ's DNA. He might have good reasons for that, especially, as I said, people who might try to start cloning Jesus Christ. So now let's come to skeptical objections to Eucharistic miracles. Skeptical objections, not all of them, but most of the time, they often presuppose the truth of atheism, which maintains a priori that miracles are impossible. And I would say that is ideological dogmatism if you hold to this position. Unless someone demonstrates the non existence of God and refutes all the arguments for his existence, we must at least remain open to the possibility of miracles and consider a priori that the probability of a miracle occurring is strictly superior to zero. Furthermore, a skeptic has to propose a plausible alternative scenario, an explanation accounting for all these independent events that strikingly resemble the Passion of Christ. So, what if you reject a Eucharistic miracle? Well, basically, you're left with two possibilities. First possibility is misidentification, so the scientists were honestly mistaken. And the second possibility is that there was a fraud involved, so these guys deliberately deceived us. So let's talk about the misidentification hypothesis first. So some skeptics say that the bacteria Serratia marcescens bacterium might contaminate the bread, causing the red pigments. So the fact that the host turns red, according to them, is explained by a bacterial contamination. This is what Kelly Kerr says in his article on Eucharistic miracles. He says, although not regularly verified, contamination with the bacteria Serratia marcescens has been suggested as a causative agent for the appearance of fresh blood on the communion bread. And so he makes an experience in his article with hosts that are dirty and are put into water. And he says that of all these non-consecrated hosts, there's approximately 15% of them that end up turning red in some circumstances, and that is because of the Serratia marcescens. So what to answer this? I would say, first of all, that does not explain things like Lanciano and Tixla, because this occurred not a week after, not 7 or 8 days after. That occurred during Mass, instantly. And the Tixla Mass, you can see the priest with the host, it happens instantly. So you won't have this explanation of the bacterial contamination coming a week or two later. But second of all, I think in general, the misidentification hypothesis is not credible because doctors, cardiologists, and pathologists are perfectly able to distinguish a bacterial contamination from an agonizing heart muscle. Saying otherwise disrespects their credibility and training. Scientists from different countries with different specializations came to the same conclusion. This cannot be just a simple confusion. So Dr. Serafini says this in his book, A Cardiologist Examines Jesus. He says it should be clarified once and for all that any microscope, even the one they gave me as a present for my first communion as a child, can deliver justice after all this nonsense. A colony of red-shaped enterobacteria indeed looks completely different from a striated heart muscle tissue. Even in the first year of medical school, in any histology course, students are taught about distinguishing the different tissues of the human body. Being unable to distinguish bacterial contamination from an organized tissue means failing grade. It's like if a pilot with 30 years of experience were accused of being unable to tell apart a runaway from a potato field when landing his plane. So Serafini says this with a lot of humor, but the idea is this. It is perfectly irrational to accuse all these different scientists in different countries at different time, saying that they're stupid enough not to be able to distinguish bacteria, contamination of bacteria, and myocardic tissue agonizing. I mean, any scientist can distinguish that, especially cardiologists, people who are specialized in the heart, like Zugibe, like the ones who studied Sokolka, Legnica, Tixla. They're all able to distinguish bacterial contamination from a suffering heart muscle tissue. I mean, saying otherwise is just saying that these doctors are stupid. So that's not it's not credible to think that in these 5 independent cases, every time there was a misidentification. Okay, so now there's the final option is general fraud. This is what I would hold to if I were an atheist. I would be forced to hold this, and I think it's still not credible either, because it would require a team of evil fraudsters substituting the samples with agonizing human heart muscle, preferably from the left ventricle, and sometimes with AB blood, and giving it to different independent scientists without any of them ever admitting any deception. I think it's not credible to think that a fraud was perpetrated by evil Christians who could have orchestrated these 5 independent Eucharistic miracles, which happen in different countries in different periods of history with different people. And so we can look at all of them individually to show that the fraud is not credible in each of the 5 cases. First of all, it's impossible to fraud for Lanciano. That's what Linoli says in his scientific paper. He says, supposing that the heart had been taken from a corpse, I affirm that only an expert in anatomical dissection could have obtained a uniform slice of a hollow organ cut tangentially to its surface, as demonstrated by the predominantly longitudinal course of the muscle fibers bundle visible in several places in the histological preparation. Furthermore, he adds, if the blood had been taken from a corpse, it would have deteriorated rapidly due to autolysis or putrefaction. So Linoli clearly says that it was impossible to fraud for Lanciano. This would require scientific techniques that were unavailable in the Middle Ages. When it comes to Buenos Aires, some have considered the hypothesis of a conspiracy theory orchestrated by investigator Ron Tesoriero, Mike Wilsey, and Ricardo Castañón Gomez. According to this theory, since the 3 investigators were under the influence of the false mystic Catalina Rivas, they wanted to make up a fraud and brought Zugibe a fake sample to analyze. Because we see on camera, when Zugibe analyzes Eucharistic miracles, that he sees heart muscle tissues suffering heart muscle tissue. And so in order to hold to the fraud hypothesis, you must hold that they brought a real piece of heart muscle tissue instead of the host that they gave to Zugibe. However, even assuming that they lied and deceived everyone for several years, which remains to be proven, how can we explain the presence of white blood cells, the leukocytes, which cannot survive outside of an organism for more than a few minutes or hours? That does not seem credible. Can we really imagine evil Christians removing a piece of inflamed heart muscle preferably from the left ventricle, and running to Zugibei's office, hoping that the white blood cells are still alive at the time of the analysis? Well, who can honestly believe that? That seems very irrational. And how can we explain the fact that Dr. Lawrence also observed the presence of living white blood cells 4 years earlier? Another heart stolen? I mean, that's just purely ad hoc. It's very hard to believe. It seems that we are faced with a desperate objection to dismiss any miracle in principle. How to fraud for Tixla? If you want to hold that Tixla is a fraud, so for this miracle to be a fraud, the team responsible for delivering the samples to the various doctors and labs would have to first find someone with AB type blood, the rarest in the world, to place this AB type blood on the suffering heart muscle they've stolen, and then give it to the scientists. And even if these frauders had managed to find a piece of suffering human heart muscles with white blood cells and the very rare AB group, that's already very hard to imagine. It still wouldn't explain why the analysis revealed that the blood came from the interior of the host. Because we said before, it's physically impossible for a forger to make blood come from inside the host. The host is only like 1 millimeter thick, so you can put blood on the outside, but you cannot make blood come from the inside. So it would be scientifically impossible to fraud in principle. And also, we could say that the DNA analysis refutes the fraud, because if it was a fraud, if the heart tissue was taken from someone else, and that they brought it to the labs, they would have seen the DNA. They would have said, oh, this heart belongs to this person. And you would have a normal genetic profile, a genetic code. But here, as we saw, it was undetectable. And this has never happened before with human tissue. So the DNA analysis refutes the fraud in itself. This does not belong to someone else's heart that they stole somewhere. Finally, for Lignica, how could they fake it? Well, for the Lignica miracle to be a fraud, the team of fraudsters would have to bring 15 different samples of dying heart muscles at two different universities in Poland, while also preparing control samples to deceive the scientists. All of this is very difficult to sustain. I don't think this is very credible. Finally, for Sokolka, how could you fake Sokolka? Well, we could say it's impossible to fraud for Sokolka because the piece of the suffering heart muscle was intrinsically linked, intrinsically attached to the substance of the host on a microscopic level, as you can see on the screen. And so, as we explained, this degree of microscopic interpenetration cannot be achieved by any current human instruments. So thus, science itself can rule out any trickery. So in summary, who can honestly believe that the conspiracy theory was at play in each of the 5 cases? Unless one has an a priori bias against the supernatural, I think the rational position is to accept the overwhelming convergence of the facts. In these 5 cases, competent and independent scientists observed a consecrated host turning into suffering heart muscle tissue. And each time the blood group was tested, it was type AB. So in face of such evidence, it seems irrational to deny the reality of the miracle. And so I would say that we can say that Eucharistic miracles confirm the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. These miracles enable us to appreciate the reality and depth of Christ's sacrifice for us on the cross. And this is not a trick or fabrication, but a manifestation of the immense and infinite love of God for mankind in the Eucharistic sacrifice. And if you guys want to go deeper on this study, please buy Serafini's book, A Cardiologist Examines Jesus. Again, it's the most rigorous book ever written on Eucharistic miracles. So please buy this book, and I will have Dr. Serafini soon again on my YouTube channel. I've already did a few interviews with him, but I will have him back again on my channel. And so thank you for listening to this presentation, and God bless everyone.
All right. Thank you so much, Matthieu, for that opening statement. Now it is my turn for my opening statement. I am going to try to keep this to 20 minutes. If I go a little bit over, apologies in advance. But without further ado, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here and for watching this debate. My name is Kevin, and I was born into a traditionalist Catholic family in the FSSP. That's the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter. I was born in 1995, and I don't say that to dox myself, but I do say that to give you an idea of where in the timeline of these events I was born, and how old I was when some news of these events were breaking. My childhood took place mostly in the 2000s, and the 2000s were a very exciting decade in the world of Eucharistic miracles. So I was born during the fivefold miracles going on at Buenos Aires, which was between 1992 and 96. And then I was 10 years old when Dr. Castellan Gomez published his results, more on that later, regarding Buenos Aires. I was 10 also when the Eucharistic miracle at Tixla occurred, and I was 16 when Dr. Castellan Gomez published the results on Tixla. I was 12 when Sokolka happened, and 13 when the local bishop gave the Eucharistic miracle of Sokolka his approval, at least giving permission to the faithful to venerate the relic. And then when I was 22, I officially left the church. I mean, not really, but I stopped practicing. How? How could I leave when I grew up with these stories of Eucharistic miracles, when the science is so certain? I remember looking into these miracles when my family was trying to convince me to stay Catholic, and being shocked at how little information I could actually find, at least at that time. I could only find information on clearly non-academic, non-scientific blogs and such. So I left the Catholic Church in 2018, but with a nagging worry that what if the science was indeed as certain as these blogs made it seem? Well, since 2018, some very useful books in scientific journals have come out, a lot of which were written by faithful Catholics. On October 19th, 2021, TAN published a book about the Eucharist called Behold It Is I by Father Elliot and Dr. Tresankos. Parts 1 and 2 of this book are theological and are written by Father Elliot, but the third part of the book is about the science of Eucharistic miracles and is written by Dr. Tresankos. On November 22nd, 2021, only 1 month after Behold It Is I was published, Sophia published A Cardiologist Examines Jesus by Dr. Serafini. On October 30th, 2024, Dr. Kierce published a paper called The Relics of Jesus and Eucharistic Miracles in a journal called Forensic Science, Medicine, and Pathology, and he published another paper a month later in the Journal of Forensic Science and Research called Scientific Analysis of Eucharistic Miracles. It is these works that allow Matthieu and I to even have this discussion today. So I am very thankful to Drs. Tresankos, Serafini, and Kierce, and more for their contributions to this field. So, if some of you in the audience don't know me, you may be asking, Kevin, did these 3 PhDs convince you that Eucharistic miracles are indeed legitimate? And should we be expecting Kevin to revert back to Catholicism any day now? Unfortunately, no. As it turns out, the science is not so certain after all. In fact, 2 of those 3 PhDs that I mentioned on the last slide actually doubt that these Eucharistic miracles are legitimate. As you already put together, Dr. Serafini does indeed think that these miracles are legitimate, but Drs. Tresankos and Kierce do not. On the slide here, you will see a quote from Dr. Tresankos' Substack. She recounts how she felt as she was researching for the book. Dr. Tresankos thought that researching for the book would give her the chance to surely find the data that she had been missing, but she only wound up more frustrated than ever. No transparency, no methods or explanations, and very little data. The conclusions did not follow. They were exaggerated and unsupported. And she had to write a book about these supposed miracles? She thought to herself, great, I get to be the jerk who points this all out. It would be so much easier to go along with the stories. Here's a chemist who became Catholic and she says the science is solid. Hallelujah. But the science isn't solid. How can Dr. Tresankos say that the science isn't solid? We just heard Matthieu's opening statement, and sure, Behold It Is I was published a month before A Cardiologist Examines Jesus, but that Substack article that we just read from was published in December of 2024. So surely Dr. Tresankos is aware of Dr. Serafini's book and the science contained within it. Dr. Serafini is convinced. Why isn't Dr. Tresankos? Well, this is a huge question, and it's going to have a case-by-case answer. The reason why anyone believes or disbelieves in the miracle of Buenos Aires will be different than their reasons for Lanciano, which will be different than their reasons for Tixla, etc. And I do want to get into each specific one later this morning when Matthieu and I have an opportunity to talk to one another. But for my opening statement, I'm going to keep things hopefully at a higher level, more concerned with methodology than with individual cases. So, if I am going to agree with Dr. Trasancos about how these Eucharistic miracles are not solid science, I should probably explain what solid science is. To do so, I'm going to hop onto clinicaltrials.gov. I work in pharma, so I am reading scientific protocols for work every day, and I thought it might be useful to show all of you what a scientific protocol looks like. FDA requires that any drug to be sold in America have its protocol uploaded to clinicaltrials.gov. And so I went onto that website and I searched for a heart-related study, which has already been completed, and I found this one, a multi-center open-label dose-ascending study to evaluate the safety of NH002 as a contrast agent in cardiac echocardiography. This study was sponsored by a company that I have never worked for, Trust Biosonics, and so I felt fine using this one as an example. This protocol is 69 pages long, and honestly, this is quite short compared to the protocols that I am reading every day for my day job. But within these pages, you will find a plan to determine whether or not NH002, an experimental drug, is safe. This is a phase 1 study, so we're not even really checking to see if it's effective yet, not as a primary endpoint anyway. The primary endpoint is just the safety. But even in these small phase 1 studies, we will still see the hallmarks of good, solid science. In section 2, we see the synopsis of the study. 36 patients will be enrolled into 3 different groups, each one getting a different dose of NH002. There are clearly defined inclusion and exclusion criteria as to who gets to participate in the study and who does not. Page 28 includes blinding information. The people who are making the decisions on whether or not the drug is safe will not know which cohort the patient is in. And every single one of these study protocols that you will ever read will contain a table like this one here, called the Schedule of Assessments, or sometimes the Schedule of Events. This table shows you what you're doing and when as part of the study. For example, take a look at that red arrow that I threw in there. It's pointing to CBC, or complete blood count with differential. That's just a blood test to make sure that the patient's blood isn't showing any signs that this drug is doing something bad to them. This CBC test will be performed before the new experimental drug is given to the patient, 60 minutes after it's given to them, 120 minutes after, 240 minutes after. So that means that the nurse is taking a blood sample 4 times from each patient just to make sure that they are still healthy after being injected with this new experimental drug. I have participated in clinical trials myself, so I can speak to firsthand what it's like to have a whole bunch of blood taken from you after you're given an experimental drug. And none of this even speaks to a totally separate document called the Central Lab Specification document. If a certain study is going to be heavy on the analytical testing and there are going to be samples coming from multiple different hospitals around the globe, then that study would likely employ a global central laboratory. This central lab is, well, exactly what it sounds like, a centralized location to do the testing, so that we know that all the samples are being treated the same. And these central lab specification documents get hyper specific. You know, things like, for this sample, you'll collect them in this kind of tube, and then you'll invert the tube this many times, then you'll centrifuge the tube for this duration at this speed, and then after that, you're going to aliquot that into this many tubes, and then you're going to freeze them, and then you'll ship them to this address, and either they'll be tested on this assay at that address, or they'll get forwarded on. You get the idea. I used to write these central lab specification documents as my day job, and I used to work for one of the companies listed on this slide here. I don't anymore. But between me participating in clinical trials in the past and me working on them, I still work on clinical trials for a living. Between the two of those things, I like to think that I understand what solid science looks like. And sadly, that just isn't what we see in these Eucharistic miracle cases. I have never seen a Eucharistic miracle testing protocol. Not in any of the books published by Dr. Ricardo Castellan Gomez, Mike Willesee, Ron Tesoriero, or Dr. Serafini. Now, Dr. Serafini's book isn't a primary source, so maybe I shouldn't expect to see a protocol there. But like maybe in like the works cited, in the bibliography of Dr. Serafini's book, but I haven't. I don't. You don't see this. You don't even see this work being published in journals. Whatever work is being done is only being presented to local bishops. And then Castellan Gomez, Willesee, and Tesoriero all write popular level books about this stuff. Neither the presentations to bishops nor the pop level books are peer reviewed. Dr. Kearse points this out in the conclusion of his paper on the importance and standardization of evaluation of Eucharistic miracles. And he adds, too, that liturgical representatives should be cautious about signing off on these miracles. So what happens when there is no protocol? Well, the answer is that almost anything can happen, I guess, since there are no guardrails to keep the study on track. But let me highlight some of the issues that I see with the various Eucharistic miracles, which I think could have been avoided or resolved if there had been a protocol in place. First up, blinding concerns. Blinding is very, very important in my day job. When a pharma company is trying to see if a drug works, the various regulatory bodies, such as FDA, make it illegal for these companies to know who is on what drug or on placebo, or if they're on the drug, what dose. Studies with insufficient blinding will not be approved by these regulatory agencies. And in the Eucharistic miracle cases, I am not aware of many where there was any blinding. I'm actually not aware of a single one where a Eucharistic miracle was submitted for analysis alongside a sample of real muscle tissue and alongside an unconsecrated host that was like treated in the same way and alongside, like, for instance, maybe some fungus or something like that. I'm not aware of any of them that actually go to that level. There is basic blinding, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But Dr. Serafini agrees with me on this concern. He calls it a weakness of Lanciano that Dr. Linoli took all the samples from the host of Lanciano himself, tested them himself, and then wrote the report by himself. Interestingly, his report calls the host, Dr. Linoli, the guy who did all the testing on Lanciano, the miraculous flesh and blood of Lanciano, literally in the first paragraph of his report. So it seems to me like there was never a doubt in Linoli's mind that this was already a miracle before he started testing, but that's neither here nor there. To give credit where credit is due, apparently Legnica did employ blinding, but like all other Eucharistic miracles, the results were never published. So I can't really say anything about how good the blinding was, and I can't compare the results from the real sample to any of the controls because nothing was published. Another problem with not having a protocol is that not all of the samples had the same testing performed on them. For example, DNA testing was not performed on Lanciano. Now, that Lanciano does get a pass because DNA testing was in its infancy back in the 70s and early 80s, but it also wasn't for Sokolka. But DNA testing was performed at Buenos Aires, Tixla, and Legnica. Why wasn't it performed at Sokolka? Who knows? There's no protocol that requires anyone to do any DNA testing, so why would it happen in the first place? What about blood testing? Folks love to talk about the AB blood, right? Blood typing was performed on Lanciano and Tixla, but never at Buenos Aires, Sokolke, or Legnica. What about blood chemistry and hematology? In this category, I am counting disconfirming results too. So, for instance, the 1992 sample from Buenos Aires had a negative test for the presence of hemoglobin, but I gave it a yes because, hey, at least testing was performed. Same at Legnica, an immunohistochemical marker test yielded negative results there. But the most consistent test performed is literally just looking at the sample on a slide under a microscope after it had been prepared, stained, and put on a slide. And evidently that didn't even happen for the 1994 Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires. Why are we so inconsistent with what testing we even do? Because we have no protocol. Why would we expect consistency if we don't have a protocol? Another concern caused by the lack of having any kind of protocol is something called testing into compliance, which is something that FDA calls unscientific and objectionable under current good manufacturing practices, CGMPs. FDA defines testing into compliance as a strategy of repeated testing until a passing result is obtained, then disregarding the out-of-specification results without scientific justification. That is exactly what Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gomez did regarding the 1996 Eucharistic miracle at Buenos Aires. He sent that sample to the following labs with the following results. First, it went to Forensic Analytical in Hayward, California, and Forensic Analytical said no known morphological features could be recognized. Second, it went to Dr. Robert Lawrence of Delta Pathology in Stockton, California, and Dr. Lawrence said, I think it's epidermis, the outer skin layer. Third, it went to the University of Sydney with Dr. Peter Ellis, and Dr. Peter Ellis also said it was skin. Number 4 went to Dr. Thomas Loy at the University of Queensland in Australia, and again said it was skin. Number 5, Dr. John Walker in Sydney, believed it could have been muscle tissue. Number 6, it went to Dr. Linoli in Italy, and that should sound familiar from Lanciano. Why are we picking our scientists again? This is weird. Regardless, Dr. Linoli said it could be heart tissue. And finally, number 7, the sample was sent to Professor Zugaba, the chief medical examiner and cardiologist in Rockland County in New York, and he said that it was heart tissue. This is a clear example of testing into compliance. And if a pharma company did this, there would be billions in fines and potential jail time for the people involved in the study. And billions is not an exaggeration. There have been multiple billion-dollar fines for off-label promotions. GSK was fined $3 billion in 2012 for offering kickbacks to doctors for prescribing Paxil for pediatric use before any pediatric safety data was available. So something that bad could be billions of dollars worth of fines. But again, I mean, there's no regulations in Eucharistic miracles, so go ahead, just test it into compliance. None of this is peer reviewed. Ignore the 5.5 misses, count the 1.5 hits, and then call it a day. Publish it, put that in front of some bishops, publish it in a popular level book, and call it a day. Who cares? There's no protocol. Okay, so we get it. They should have had a protocol, but they didn't, and because they didn't, the testing was inconsistent and lacked peer review and lacked blinding. But all we have is what we have. So we need to decide on whether or not these Eucharistic miracles are real miracles or not based on the science that we do have, right? Not the science that we don't have. And what we do have, though perhaps inconsistent, looks pretty compelling, right? So we should believe that these are Eucharistic miracles, even if we should also wish that there was a protocol and maybe even push for retesting of some of these samples and stuff. But in the meantime, we should believe, right? No, we should not. Why not? Because so much of the evidence that people like Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gomez, Ron Tesoriero, and Mike Willesee, so much of the evidence that they point to is also evidence of simple contamination. Let me explain. So Lanciano and Buenos Aires both tested the blood type and found it was AB, right? So the blood of those hosts was blood type AB. Not so fast, says Eucharistic minister and Catholic scientist Dr. Kelly Kears. Dr. Kears points out that a sample could test positive for AB without any red blood cells even being present. And here's the thing, Dr. Serafini knows this. In chapter 11 of his book, he points out how a 1977 study of Israeli skeletons wound up testing that 51% of those people had blood type AB, when we know that it's only like 5% of them should have had blood type AB. Dr. Serafini does add, but that was 1977, and today we have better methods. Well, since Dr. Kears's 2024 paper came out, in which, so he was critiquing Dr. Serafini's 2021 book. Dr. Serafini wrote a paper in March of 2025 in response to Dr. Kears's book, in which Dr. Serafini says that Dr. Kears was not without good reason to call out this problem with the AB blood type. But Dr. Serafini cautions against rejecting an important wealth of knowledge obtained by authoritative researchers who applied rigorous scientific standards to their studies. Well, then in April of 2025, Dr. Kears wrote another reply to Dr. Serafini, and Dr. Kears writes that Dr. Serafini's main concern is that excessive scientific prudence will put people off of a topic such as the study of Eucharistic miracles. Unfortunately, this viewpoint fails to realize that incautious scientific investigation of such subjects may, in fact, be of much greater harm in the long run. I can speak to this in person. I have explained all of this information to many Catholics, and I've seen them deflate when they learn the truth that scientists like Dr. Trasankos and Dr. Kears are trying to explain to people. That you shouldn't put your faith in these Eucharistic miracles because the science just doesn't hold up. And the blood typing, that's not my only methodological concern here. In fact, my biggest concern is about DNA. As a reminder, DNA testing was performed at Buenos Aires, Tixla, and Legnica. But let's look at those results. At Buenos Aires, no human DNA profile could be determined by means of standard STR analysis. Same story in Tixla. No protein coding gene sequences could be identified in, nor could any useful genetic markers be amplified. And it's the same at Legnica. No DNA amplifications were obtained by PCR technology at the Institute of Forensic Medicine, and University of Szczecin claims to have found enough DNA to know that it was human DNA, but didn't share anything else conveniently enough. This is probably super disappointing to people who actually hoped to have real empirical evidence of Eucharistic miracles. If we found human DNA, then we could sequence that human DNA. And if that DNA was the same at each Eucharistic miracle, that would be astonishing. That would be incredible evidence. But we don't have that. We're not even finding human DNA. We're finding DNA, but who knows if it's human? Maybe it's yeast DNA. Maybe it's fungus DNA. But oddly, Dr. Castellan Gomez seems to be able to put a nice marketing spin on this. Dr. Castellan Gomez says that the lack of DNA results is somehow evidence of supernatural DNA. But Dr. Trasankos, in her book, which came out a month before Dr. Serafini's book, points out something crucial. What Dr. Castellan Gomez points to as evidence of supernatural DNA is also just evidence of no DNA. And what's more likely? That we test for DNA and we don't find any human DNA? What's more likely? There's actually no human DNA, or there is human DNA, but it's supernatural human DNA, and that's why we're not finding it, right? There's an invisible elephant in the middle of this room right now, and he's also intangible, but he's there, I promise. That's the extent of what Dr. Castellan Gomez is saying. I have a hard time talking about this without a look of incredulity appearing on my face because of just how strange it is to me that somebody who, Dr. Ricardo Castellan Gomez, he has a PhD in something. He's not a medical doctor, but he has a PhD in something. How can he think that this is evidence of supernatural DNA? I have my theories for why he thinks that. And I look forward to getting to that in the dialogue section. Dr. Kears makes the same point that Dr. Trasankos does. Dr. Castellan Gomez is over-exaggerating his findings. The low concentration of human DNA that was recovered is characteristic of contaminating DNA, the likely result of someone touching the sample. This is a very different situation than having an abundant amount of human DNA which could not be amplified. And again, if we had an entire chunk of human heart tissue visible to the naked eye, there would be more than enough DNA present, but somehow there isn't. It doesn't add up. And to drive his point home, Dr. Kears did his own Eucharistic miracles at home experiment. He took unconsecrated wafers and left them out, placed them in water, and then checked them a few days later. And he made his own Eucharistic miracles with a 15% success rate. That's amazing. 15%. Then he inoculated some hosts with a fungus known to turn red and look like blood, and he got very similar results to those 15. He even took DNA samples from that host that he inoculated, and he was able to replicate the whole, we got DNA, but we couldn't find the human STRs thing that was going on. And what does that tell you? That this is probably just evidence of contamination. Wait, so are you saying that this has been contamination the whole time? Are you saying it's been fungus the whole time? That's what Dr. Kears did. He inoculated the host with fungus, and then he got human DNA, but not human DNA, just DNA. So Kevin, has it been fungus the whole time? Yeah, probably. I think so. I mean, in addition to the work that Dr. Kelly Kearse did, which shows that all the evidence that Dr. Castellan Gomez points to as evidence of the supernatural of these miracles is also just evidence of contamination, we also have news headlines like these. St. Paul, 2011, fungus. Salt Lake City, 2015, fungus. And remember this one from just earlier this year? Indianapolis, 2025. Probably fungus. They didn't say what it was, but they said it's not supernatural. Now, if any one of these gets a least likely to be fungus award, it's probably like Nika, because apparently they did test to see if it was fungus, and they said that they didn't. But again, the results were never published, so I can't really comment. They say that they tested for fungus and it wasn't fungus. So okay, like Nika, that's good, great. Publish your results, please, in a peer-reviewed scientific journal article. But anyway, I'm over time at this point. I didn't get to talk about Dr. Castellan Gomez and his whole cast of people and how they were investigating Eucharistic miracles because of this Catholic mystic who told them that like Jesus was speaking through her and Jesus is telling you to go investigate these Eucharistic miracles. So we'll talk about that in the actual in the dialogue on Thursday morning, which I am very much so looking forward to. But until then, hang tight, everybody, and we'll be right back. Thanks so much. And now that our opening statements have been completed, Matthieu, I believe that you have a few slides in response to my opening statement, and then we'll just launch into the open dialogue after that. Is that right?
Yeah, perfect. So let me share my slides. I think you can see it now.
Yes, I can. There we go.
Okay, great. So thank you, Kevin, for your opening presentation. I wanted to respond to a few points you made in that opening presentation. You talked about the fact that there's no peer-reviewed journal articles about Eucharistic miracles, and I had a few thoughts and responses to that objection. First of all, I would say that in the context of Eucharistic miracles, only the bishop has the authority to decide what to do with the samplings. So you cannot just treat it like any other material for peer review, since for believers, the material in question to be analyzed has unique characteristic of sacredness and preciousness. So it's not just like any type of samplings you could set to peer-reviewed papers. Secondly, even if no published papers peer-reviewed papers result from scientific investigation, typically we do have official signed reports detailing what tests they performed and what they found. So I don't see why we should be demanding published peer-reviewed articles in addition to that. I don't think this is an absolute necessary condition in order for the miracle to be credible. Plus, I could say that these Eucharistic miracle in examinations are much more like forensic and criminal investigations, where we just need to identify the nature of a sample with basic testing. Everyone, of course, trusts the reports of scientists consulted for forensic and criminal investigations, even though those are rarely published in peer-reviewed scientific literature. I would also say that it's not very surprising that the findings aren't published in peer-reviewed articles because the church leads the investigations and they only need to do a simple determination of the nature of the sample, which can be satisfactorily done via official reports from the labs and the scientists. So they don't really need to go as far as to push for peer-reviewed publications in order to confirm the miracle in the diocese. And I would also say that the scientists involved don't have much of an incentive to write up the findings into a published paper, since they're not often even told of the origin of the sample, and it isn't even their own collected sample, so they're not the guys who are going to push for a peer-reviewed journal. Um, Moreover, journals probably wouldn't publish the findings to begin with because journals are usually interested in new research or case studies. They generally don't care about identifying this kind of sample or this kind of sample. Journals don't care if you were to send an unidentified sample and identify it as a certain kind of tissue or with a certain kind of blood type. That's not a study case they're interested in. It's not what they wants to publish in peer-reviewed journals. Of course, here Kevin might object that in these cases, journals would be interested in a case study of a miracle, bread turning into a heart tissue. But journals are very unlikely to take an author seriously if they say some identified heart muscle tissue came from a consecrated host. So again, there's not much of an incisive to submit to peer-reviewed journals, given that they almost certainly won't accept the article in question. I would also say that peer-reviewed journals will gladly publish things that are hostile towards miracle, but very rarely articles that are in favor of it. Why? Well, because peer reviewers are very often hostile towards the supernatural in general. They have a naturalistic bias. And here you can see the case of the physical death of Jesus Christ I put on the slide, and here are articles trying to debunk the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So that's the kind of things that are more going to be published in these kinds of peer-reviewed journals, but they're not interested in having things that confirm the supernatural, because in universities you have a form of naturalistic bias. Finally, I would say that even you, Kevin, you rely on scientific determinations of consulted scientists and laboratories when you point out that many cases of potential Eucharistic miracles turned out to be false, or fungi or bacteria. That's what you say in your video. So I would say those findings weren't published in a peer-reviewed journals, yet you trust them because you put them in your video. So therefore, I would say that your criticism is kind of inconsistent on this point, because I don't think there's an absolute necessity to always have peer-reviewed journals in order to establish a scientific investigation of a sample. Secondly, you object with the method. You say there's methodological flaws in Eucharistic miracles, and you accuse them of having no standardized protocol in your video. And so I would say that I agree with you. It would be better and ideal to have an absolute standardized protocols for sure. But I think what we do have is enough. The labs have protocols for various tests they're going to do. They have certain blood tests, tissues tests, pathological tests. The protocols are up to the laboratories and the scientists, not to the leading investigators. So the investigators are not at fault here. They just give the samples to the lab and the scientists and ask, what is it? And then they leave the protocol up to the labs or the scientists. So it's not their fault of the no standardized protocol. Even though I agree with you, it would be good to have a standardized protocol for the future of Eucharistic miracles. Then you object in your video by saying there was no blinding. And so you say that blinding in most Eucharistic miracle cases lacked any testing that was blind. I disagree with that. It's true for Lanciano, you're right, but I don't think that changes the rigor and the protocol provided by Linoli in his published scientific article in a journal. Most importantly, Linoli had no prior expectation to find heart tissue with AB type blood, since this was the first time this had been tested on a Eucharistic miracle. And so, since it was the first time it happened, he had no preconceived idea of what he was able to find. So, the fact that he didn't do it with a blind test, that's not going to influence him much on finding heart tissue. Secondly, I would say this is false for Buenos Aires. All the doctors who examined the samples from 2000 to 2004, so from Lawrence to Zugibe, they didn't know where the sample came from. And here's even Zugibe admitting it in his own letter in 2005, which is here on the screen. He says, as you can see, I was not informed of the history of the material. And so he even confirms that he did blind testing. I would say it's false for Tixla, because blind testing was done in every independent scientific lab that it was sent to. It's also false to say there was no blind testing for Sokolka, because Dr. Sulovsky did not know the origin of the sample, and he came to the same conclusion as Dr. Lotowska independently. So there was blind testing in both Tixla, Sokolka, and also in Legnica. It's even mentioned in Serafini's book, because they took sampling procedures, as you say, as Serafini mentions in his book, and they took even control samples who were set up with non-consecrated hosts. And so, yeah, there was blind testing in 4 cases out of 5, Buenos Aires, Tixla, Sokolka, Legnica, and as I said, for Lanciano, there was no blind testing, but Linoli had no preconceived ideas of what he was being able to find. So I think the procedure is still very rigorous in general. Then you object for Buenos Aires by saying there was testing into compliance. So the objection is that they went from doctor to doctor until they finally got heart tissue. So first they went to Dr. Lawrence. He said it was skin cells, but there was the white cells present. Then they went to Australia with Dr. Ellis, John Walker, etc. And then finally they arrived to Zugibe, to Linoli and Zugibe, who said it was myocardic tissue. I would say, first of all, this objection is not, it only works for Buenos Aires. I mean, if even if we weren't to grant this objection, that would not apply to the four other cases. So this is only for Buenos Aires. And I would say that your hypothesis doesn't explain the scientist's verdict for the Buenos Aires case, because as we've seen, some said they saw skin, some said they saw myocardic tissue, but none of them hold to your hypothesis, which is fungi or bacterial contamination. So my question to you is, how can bacteria produce human tissue with white blood cells? Because that wasn't only seen by Zugibe. If you were right about this being bacteria or fungal contamination, we would expect at least some scientists would have noticed it, but none of them did. None of them reported it was bacteria or fungal contamination, contrary to other false Eucharistic miracles where they proved it was bacteria. Um, I would also say that given the nature of the sample, we would expect the tissue is hard to identify since it lacked the morphological characteristics of a normal, healthy human heart tissue. So if you're not a world expert like Zugibe on what heart tissue looks like after a heart attack, it might be hard to identify. And this is why all the doctors in Australia, Peter Ellis, John Walker, had difficulty in identifying it because they're not expert in that domains. They weren't specialists of that special domain of expertise, contrary to Zugibe, who his domain of expertise, speciality, is concerned about human heart tissue after severe trauma. So that's why they went to Zugibe to have the definitive answer. I asked about Ron Tesoriero about this and why Dr. Lawrence didn't see a human heart. And he said the determination that it was skin by Dr. Lawrence and others, and the uncertainty before Zugibe was because they did not have the specialty of forensic cardiology to make a distinction between epidermis, so skin, and heart tissue that had undergone trauma. Heart that suffered trauma and inquiry reveals a very different architecture, and it requires an expert in that field to interpret that. And so he says, in the end of if one has to, sorry, he says, in the end, all one now has to do, if they don't believe him, is to go to look for a pathology image that showed a myocardial infraction 3 days after, and compare that image with the image of the microscopic slides we do have for Buenos Aires. And that you will see for yourself. And so here on the screens, I have put myocardial infraction on the top picture. That's what it looks like. And what you see for Buenos Aires on the bottom, this looks very, very, very similar. And once Dr. Lawrence saw this, once Zugibe and the team pointed this out to him, then he came back and he revoked his former statement. So that explains why the different kinds of result by the scientists. And finally, I would say we do have the slides for Buenos Aires. They're visible on camera. You can see Dr. Lawrence showing the white cells here. And so they don't look like bacteria. I mean, if you look slides of bacteria, they won't look like this. So we do see on screen the white cells being present. And so you cannot say this looks like fungi or bacteria. I mean, that's not going to be defensible for the Buenos Aires case. Um, Another objection you raise in your video is the AB type blood and the possibility of a false positive. So that's what Kelly Kurz says in his article, saying that a sample could test positive for AB without having any red blood cells being present. And I would say, yeah, Serafini and I agree about this. We do agree. Well, Serafini, who is an expert, agrees, and I agree with experts. So he agrees. However, we have done many, many type of blood tests on Egyptian mummies and very old tissues and things like that with the same methods that they used in Lanciano. And here is what they got on 14 Egyptian mummies from the necropolis of Doge. Here is what they found. They found some O, they found some B, one AB, and then AAA, BB, things like that. And when you look at the Christian tissues like Lanciano, Tixla, and even the three relics, the Shroud of Turin, Suardum of Oviedo, and Tunic of Argentite, as I said in my presentation, you never find anything else than AB. It's always AB, 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 AB. So even if there's a possibility of a false contamination, I agree it's a theoretical possibility, but what is the probability that in 15 different tests on the screen you can see, you always get AB, and with different methods. It's not only the method that Linoli used in the 1970s, the absorption illusion. In Tixla, they use the immunofluorescence, which is a better modern method for A/B testing. And so again, what is the probability that you always get AB, 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 AB? When you do it with other ancient tissues like Egyptian mummies, you get very different results, almost never AB and mostly OA, things like that. So again, Kelliker's objection is not decisive in terms of probability here, even if there remains a theoretical possibility of false attribution. Okay, and you say in your video that Dr. Kurz made his own Eucharistic miracles at home. I would say this has already been refuted in my presentation with the misidentification hypothesis. Doctors, I would say, are perfectly able to distinguish bacterial contamination from an agonizing heart tissue. Saying otherwise amounts to saying that all these experts that have studied Eucharistic miracles in Lanciano, Buenos Aires, Sokolka, Tixla, Legnica, all these experts in different countries at different times with different methods, they all came to the same conclusion of myocardic tissue, and they could not recognize myocardic tissue agonizing with bacteria. I mean, how can one seriously believe that? So I don't think this is a credible hypothesis. And so, and it wouldn't explain the bacterial contamination. That doesn't explain Lanciano and Tixla when the miracle occurred instantly during Mass, not a few weeks later. So not any time for the contamination to occur. So I think that this is a desperate hypothesis, the misidentification hypothesis. And so you point out in your video that there are false Eucharistic miracles, and that proves that the dioceses are prudent in this, that they do scientific tests, and when tests reveal that there's a bacterial contamination, they say it, they publish it, it's in the news. And so the Catholic Church is open to they're having real Eucharistic miracles on one hand, where we can distinguish bacteria from a real suffering heart muscle tissue, and false Eucharistic miracles like bacterial contamination. So yeah, scientists can distinguish that, and these articles prove it. So in conclusion, I would say that your presentation, I don't think it has sufficiently answered the specific cases and arguments I bring up in my own presentation. That's normal because you didn't see my presentation beforehand. So I would say that unless one has an a priori bias against the supernatural, I think the rational position is to accept the overwhelming convergence of the facts. In these 5 cases, competent, independent scientists observed a consecrated host turning into suffering heart muscle, and that's the central argument. It's not about DNA or stuff like that. That's the central argument, heart muscle tissue. So in face of such evidence, I think it's irrational to deny the reality of these 5 independent miracles, and I've shown in my presentation that if you want to deny this, you either have to hold for misidentification, I explain why this is not credible, or for the collective fraud hypothesis in each of the 5 cases. And I explain for each of the 5 cases why this is not credible. So in the end, I think that Eucharistic miracles are still a good argument in favor of Catholicism. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Matthieu. That was awesome. For the remainder of our time today, the plan is just to have a normal conversation. We've had enough slides. So Matthieu, I jotted down a bunch of questions that I wanted to ask you. I think that you jotted down some questions to ask me. So I think at this point, we'll just go back and forth and kind of ask each other questions and just have a conversation.
Yeah, sure. Do you want
Awesome.
me to start asking the questions, or do you want to start?
If you don't mind, I have one that kind of curtails nicely off the end of your presentation.
Okay, yeah.
So in both in your rebuttal that you just did and around the 46-minute and 30-second mark into your opening statement, you mentioned that you don't think that the misidentification hypothesis is credible because it's not realistic to think that so many experts could be so wrong about these samples being heart tissue. I'm actually
Yeah,
going to
exactly.
I'm going to propose the idea that you actually already accept that misidentification can happen. And the reason I'm going to propose that is because of Buenos Aires. So, 7 different scientists were sent the sample between 2000 and 2004. And those 7 different scientists. So first we had Forensic Analytical in California, and they said there's no known morphology here. We have no idea. This isn't organ tissue. It's nothing. Um, and then Dr. Robert Lawrence of Delta Pathology in California said that it was skin cells. Dr. Peter Ellis at the University of Sydney said skin cells. Dr. Thomas Loy at the University of Queensland said it was skin cells. Dr. John Walker in Sydney said maybe it's muscle tissue. Then it was conveniently sent to Dr. Linoli, who worked on Lanciano, and he said maybe it's heart tissue. And then a separate sample was wound up being sent to Zugaba because the sample that was sent to, was it Dr. Walker, was lost. Do you know that whole thing? It's this whole
I know
confusing.
about it, and Dr. Tesoriero talked to me about. I can send you what
Ooh,
he answered by email if you're interested.
very
Um,
interested. Yeah, but even putting the fact that it's a separate sample to the side for now, um, I'm going to put forward the idea that you already think that misidentification is possible because you think that um, doctors like Dr. Robert Lawrence, Dr. Peter Ellis, Dr. Thomas Loy, and Dr. John Walker all misidentified the heart tissue.
Yeah, so I would say that we have to distinguish between two kinds of misidentification. One misidentification is can be seen by any like beginner in scientific in medicine, as Serafini says in his book, A Cardiologist Examines Jesus, page 91, that even in the first year of medical school, any histology course students are taught about distinguishing different tissues of the human body. Being unable to distinguish bacterial contamination from an organized tissue means failing the grade. It's like if a pilot with 30 years of experience were accused of being unable to tell apart a runaway from a potato field when landing his plane. So when it comes to distinguishing heart muscle tissue at agony with bacterial contamination, you can see the obviously the difference even for any kind of scientist. However, to see the difference between a skin cell, like a part of the human body, and a specific part of the heart, after 3 years in distilled water and things like that. As I said in my rebuttal to your presentation, you have to be a sort of expert in forensic medicine and cardiology. And this is the domain of expertise of Zugibe, not the other guys in Australia, John Walker, Peter Ellis, and Dr. Lawrence. And so this is not the same kind of misidentification. It is more easily to be mistaken about something that resembles more heart tissue than something of a completely different nature, bacterial contamination. And as we see on the screen, you have the screenshots of what was seen under the microscope in Buenos Aires. That doesn't look like bacterial contamination.
And that's actually my next question for you. If you like, so um, you raised this point. Like, it doesn't look like bacteria; it looks like human heart tissue. This is an honest question. This is not a gotcha or anything. But do you know how the slides were prepared for Buenos Aires? I don't know, and I reread Dr. Serafini's book last night. Um, I even put together this little slide to show you 2 quotes from the book. Um, but they have to do with Lanciano and Tixla, not Buenos Aires. Actually, here, I don't know. Let me just read it. So, regarding Lanciano, this comes from chapter 2 of Dr. Serafini's book. We have here's the quote from chapter 2. Professor Nonoli took a 318 milligram sample from this stony and clay-like substance to clarify its nature and the species of the organism that it came from. Microscope slides were prepared for microtome slicing and the usual hematoxylin and eosin stain. Those are 2 very commonly used stains when we are trying to identify human organ tissue. And then for Tixla, again, we have the hematoxylin and the eosin stains. And this comes from chapter 4 of Dr. Serafini's book. But I reread all of chapter 3, the Buenos Aires chapter, and I didn't see anything about what the slides were prepared with. My guess is that they were prepared with hematoxylin and eosin. Do you know if that's true? I legitimately don't
Um,
know.
I don't know either. If you're interested, I could ask Dr. Serafini about it.
That'd
All I
be
do know for Buenos Aires is that Ron Tesorero had his camera and that he filmed everything during the preparation, so you could see the sample being taken
mhm.
off, putting into the tube. They named the tube with the date, not saying what it was. And so I think the scientific procedure was done under other eyewitnesses with the camera film. So it's pretty rigorous, I would say.
Oh, yeah, I'm not questioning the rigorousness with which they applied those stains. Um, Instead, the reason I'm bringing up the stains is because if you want to look at fungus and bacteria, you don't actually use those stains. You use different stains. Um, so I grabbed a paper published in the Journal of Pathology of Nepal called Histopathology of Important Fungal Infections, a summary. And in the useful stains section of this paper, um, it it says that hematoxylin and eosin are like the routine histopathology stains. But if you want to see fungal or bacterial infection, you want to use GMS or PAS stains, which those are two totally different stains. Um, so in other words, what I'm saying is these samples were prepared as if they were human organ tissue, and then they gave them to histopathologists, many of whom said, well, the first of whom said, this doesn't look like anything to me. But then
Actually,
ultimately,
when they sent it to the forensic lab in California, their first attempt was to do DNA testing, not
mhm.
to ask if it was heart tissue. So that's not what they looked for at the forensic lab in 1999.
No, but in 2000, at oh, hold on, I
Lawrence,
have uh
yeah.
not Lawrence, in the other lab in California, the one the quote from the lab is no known morphological characteristics. Um and that to me is like, that's just somebody being like, looking at a slide and being like, I don't I don't even see cells here, dude. Like, I just see broken up organic like,
They,
stuff.
they found a small quantity of human DNA in the reports of the California lab. They said there was human DNA present in small portions. I know what Stacy Trasenko says to that in response. They said it could have been touched by human hands, but when you look at the video, when they take the samples off, they don't put their hands on the sample. They take it, like this and put it in tubes, so it's not coming to contact with human hands. Of course, they're not stupid. Uh, yeah.
Well, the priest certainly handled the host prior to, like, when he picked it up and put it into the chalice.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, at the beginning, yeah, but then when
Right.
it distilled water, yeah. Okay, if you want, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm,
Um,
you can't exclude. You can't. I agree with you that you cannot exclude with 100% certainty the possibility of there being a small portion of human DNA. So that's why the I don't the forensic lab studies doesn't show anything miraculous because it was focused on pretty much on DNA testing. And so to me, the strongest case is the Zugibe analysis because he's the world expert in cardiology and he's the specialist who is the best qualified to study such sample.
I've got a question for you. Um,
Yeah.
so, do you know what about uh, Zugaba makes his opinion so much more valuable than the other six scientists? Particularly when it's my understanding that Zugaba, he literally just looked at a slide. Like, there was no testing involved. He just looked
Under
at
the
a slide,
microscope.
right?
Yeah,
Right.
he does this like he's specialized in legal medicine. So when there's an accident, he looks at samples and he looks it usually under the microscope and he can tell what it is. So I mean, a microscope, a sophisticated microscope, is enough to tell for
Oh,
a heart expert
strong disagree. Strong disagree.
for
And the
these kinds
reason,
of things.
hmm?
Because when you look at the video, if the video is on internet, Zugibe looks at the slide under the microscope, and without hesitation, he says, "Oh, this is heart muscle. This is heart tissue. I can even describe everything like that." And he has a long quote, spontaneous comments, And he has no doubts. It's like, yeah, that's look what I see in accidents where someone has been beaten over the chest, and he's very fluid in that. And so I think that we can be confident that a heart expert like him knows what he's talking about when he sees stuff under the microscope, right?
So I'm not calling into question Dr. Zugaba's expertise. However, what I am calling into question is the idea that we can identify organ tissue by just looking at it. That's so I work in clinical trials for a living. And if a pharma company tried to get a drug approved by just being like, but we had doctors look at these slides and just look at them, aren't they great? Like, that's not gonna cut it. There's always empirical testing that goes along with it. So for instance, one of those empirical tests is something that you already brought up, genome sequencing. And we didn't even find not a single one of the standard human STRs when we did genetic sequencing, which to me should be the first red flag. And there are organ specific, there are ways to determine using empirical methods what organ a piece of tissue comes from, and none of those were performed. So all that we have here is six scientists, well, 5.5 scientists who looked at a sample and said, it's not heart tissue, right? It's either skin or maybe muscle or nothing. And I said 5.5 because we have maybe it's heart tissue from Dr. Lanoli, so that's half. And then we have
John
one.
Walker.
No, John Walker said muscle tissue. He didn't say heart
who's
tissue.
the other? Because apart from Linoli, there's another guy who said it might be myocardic tissue.
So no, the 7, at least this comes from chapter 3 of Dr. Serafini's book. In order, it's forensic analytical in Hayward, California, no known morphology. Number 2, it's Dr. Robert Lawrence of Delta Pathology in Stockton, California, epidermis. Number 3 is Dr. Peter Ellis at Sydney, skin cells. Dr. Thomas Loy, Queensland, skin cells. Dr. John Walker, could be muscle tissue.
Yeah,
Professor Lanoli could be heart tissue.
But heart is a muscle, so it's saying it could be muscle tissue that's compatible with myocardic tissue because heart is a muscle.
You're not
it's
wrong.
just more general.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree that that's this difference with the first scientist. It's kind of weird, but I gave the explanation in my rebuttal of why this is the case. And for heart that suffers severe trauma, they don't look like they lack the morphological characteristics of a normal healthy heart. So if you're not a world expert on the heart, on what the heart looks like after a brutal accident, then you're not going able to identify it easily. And so that's why they called a specialist to do that, because it's not for if your specialty in medicine is not cardiology and things like that, then it's going to be more difficult for you to give the proper identification. And so I would say it's not a decisive argument against Zugibe's analysis, because he's the most qualified to pronounce himself on this.
I've got a question for you. Do you think that if the first lab that they sent the sample to, Forensic Analytical in Hayward, California, if they said, yeah, this is human heart tissue, do you think that Dr. Castellan Gomez would have continued to send around the sample to all of these different labs?
I don't know. Maybe he would, because it's always good to have many different people who have the same conclusion. So it's difficult to imagine what he would have done in this circumstance if this had arrived, because we cannot rewind the past.
So that's true.
We can ask him. I have his phone number if you want. I can ask him.
But you have Dr. Castellan Gomez's phone number?
Yeah, and I have.
I would love to speak. I've been brushing up on my Spanish. I would love to. Does he speak English? He might. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Maybe English, yeah, but
it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I would love to speak to him.
Yeah.
I think that we can know, and the reason I say that is because he sent it around for 4 years to 7 scientists, and he only stopped once he got the answer that he was clearly looking for.
Because
I think
it was the most definitive answer, like the most authoritative answer, right?
I have a feeling that if he sent it to the first lab and he got the result he wanted, that would be the most definitive answer. Like, isn't it just kind of, and first of all, why would he send it to 6 doctors in a row who weren't experts? Like, if he was sending it to them and he was like, nah, they don't know what they're talking about, I'm just going to send it to them anyway. What?
Mm.
Like, that's kind of
But then
weird, right?
but the lab, the forensic lab, didn't. His goal was not to study the if it was a heart tissue. His goal was study to if there was DNA or blood or things like that, but not the morphological aspect of the sample, I believe.
Forensic Analytical in Hayward, California did issue a statement on the morphology of the slide. Also, they wouldn't send a slide if they weren't asking about the morphology. They could just send a sample, like they could have just taken like a whole blood sample or an extracted DNA sample and sent that to Forensic Analytical. So the fact that they
Their
sent
main
this,
goal, the main goal of the lab was to get the DNA, the STR analysis. That's
then
why
why'd they send them a slide?
I don't know. We have to ask
Like
them.
a histology slide. They were clearly looking for the morphological characteristics if they sent a histology slide. Um,
Sure, but even if you grant like testing into compliance, how do you explain that a heart expert, a professional cardiologist who has 10,000 autopsies to his name, just like magically comes out with the conclusion that, oh, it's heart muscle tissue suffering? I mean, you at this point you necessarily have to say that he's incompetent in his domain, right? That's the only possible option. To be
yeah,
severely wrong, to confuse that with bacteria, that's yeah.
I don't think that he was incompetent. Um, Also, what do you make of the whole thing where, according to Dr. Zuguba's widow, who is still alive, Dr. Zuguba has passed away, but according to Dr. Zuguba's widow, Dr. Zuguba never believed in the miracle of Buenos Aires. I have no idea what to make of all of that.
Okay, yeah, so I'll tell you the story about that because I've talked to his wife and I've talked to
Oh,
his close associates. So, yeah, on Facebook, I've contacted them. I've talked on the phone with Zugibe's close associate. I won't tell his name for his privacy, but what happened is that Zugibe, after the miracle, did not approve that they used his name to put the miracle forward because they did not use the standard Catholic procedure. So the standard Catholic procedure for a miracle is that the bishop comes and tells this scientist, please study this material, tell us what it is, just like they did with Linoli. And Zugibe, they came at his office, filming him, not telling him what it was. And Zugibe asked them to tell him what it was because as a medical doctor, he always knows where the samples come from before studying them. So he's not used to doing blind testing, and he did not appreciate for them forcing him to do blind testing, and so Zugibe didn't like the usual standard Catholic procedure was not respected. His close friend told me that he's very a procedure like you have to follow the procedure, the procedure, the procedure, and if it's not respected, he doesn't really like that. So he gave his letter next year in 2005. So this proves that he did not reject the miracle in question because his 2005 letter comes a year after the studies and he has the proof where he says this is what I saw, and so he didn't like the fact that people use his name like that to attest to the miracle because he's a guy who's attached to the procedure, and he didn't like the fact that they didn't follow what's uh, the usual standard Catholic procedure, like they did with Linoli. And so that's what I understood from talking about them. Zugibe does not claim this is a false miracle. He just doesn't, his wife apparently says he doesn't want to be associated with it. That's what his wife says.
my understanding was that Zuguba never like he I don't know if he ever said it's a false miracle, but I think that he said like I don't believe that it's an authentic miracle.
Where? Because I have not found any
Oh, maybe you
written
might be
or
right.
oral statement on Zugibe. He died in 2013. So if he
Mhm.
had rejected this as a miracle, of course, having people use his name throughout the world, putting forward Buenos Aires, of course, between the period of 2004 and 2013, the period of his death, he would have had the time to retract and said, no, 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 I don't want to be associated with that. However, we have positive evidence that he did approve because his 2005 letter says,
He
yes,
signed it.
that's what I saw. He signed it. So
Yeah, I
that's
agree.
definitive proof. And this has more authority than what his wife could say because that's Zugibe's word. And Zugibe's word has more authority than what his wife can say about it.
I agree. I just find the whole thing very confusing.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree.
but I agree. I mean, he signed something that says like, yeah, I approve I approve this message, and then he signed off. So it's like, well, okay, that's kind of the best thing that we can hope for in this kind of situation. I just find it very confusing that his widow says these things about him. But yeah, I guess that's neither here nor there. I asked you a bunch of questions in a row, and I know that you wrote down questions for me. I have a bunch more for you too, but I want to give you a chance to ask me a few questions too.
Yeah, so thanks. One question, I have two questions for you that I thought of. My first question is, if Eucharistic miracles were true, would you convert to Catholicism?
Um, so maybe not Catholicism, because I think that they could also be evidence of something like Orthodoxy.
Yeah,
Um,
okay. At
but
least traditional Christianity, apostolic
yeah,
Christianity.
almost definitely. I mean, like I can't imagine me not. Obviously, it's hard
Okay.
to speak like, you know, um, counterfactually, but like almost definitely, yeah.
Hmm. Okay. And my second question is, what would convince you that Eucharistic miracles are true? Propose a necessary and sufficient list of criteria.
That's actually very easy for me. The DNA thing would get me in a heartbeat. So imagine I'm going to sketch out a scenario that would be undeniable to me, at least. Um,
I know what you're going
so
to say.
so yeah. So like in maybe not for. So imagine that today we went back and we tested Lanciano. We did genetic profiling, and we got an entire human genome, and it also matched, like, this is what we think that the DNA of a first century Jew from Palestine would have. Whoa, that's weird. Okay. And then they do Buenos Aires, so we get the exact same genome. Whoa, that was 20 years apart that we did the sampling anyway. And I mean, that sample is from at least from like the 16th century. So how do we have the same DNA from the 16th century and then in the 1990s, and then we do Tixla in 2006 and it's the same DNA, and then we do Sokolka and it's the same DNA, and then we did like Nika and it's the same DNA. Oh my gosh, I don't think I could deny it.
So yeah, we have that for the AB blood, but for but okay, for the DNA, just talk about the DNA. I agree that if it were to happen, it would be proof. But I don't think it's a necessary condition for there to be proof because there's three elements that we can look for. Either the myocardic tissue, the AB blood, or the DNA. Um, in my opinion, the strongest case is the 5 out of 5 myocardic tissue. Uh, so, like in 5 different cases in different countries at different periods of time, competent scientists, most of them doing it blindly, uh, went agreed together that it was agonizing myocardic tissue. So that in itself is supernatural in nature, even if you don't have the precise genetic code or the DNA. So I don't think, and even if there was a genetic code or DNA, the skeptic could also say, "Oh, well, this must be a fraud or misidentification. Oh, they go wrong." If you can say Zugibe was wrong and he confused bacteria with suffering heart tissue, he could, the labs can also be wrong in identifying a genetic code, or there can be a fraud. So I think that if this were to happen, real skeptics like you would probably say it's either fraud or misidentification, right?
Uh, so I don't disagree entirely, because somebody could just be like, no, I still am not convinced even after the DNA thing. But me personally, I'm pretty sure that I would be convinced if the DNA thing happened. I don't know. And like, especially if it was published in peer reviewed journals and you had all these scientists from all of these like companies that actually do genetic sequencing, companies like Thermo Fisher Scientific, Icon Lab. If we had companies like that were all publishing these reports and all the DNA matched, a
Yeah,
skeptic,
but
sure, somebody could just
sure.
insist, but it would get me.
So
It would convince me.
So it seems that your position is presupposing that DNA testing is a necessary condition in order to conclude that there is a supernatural event going on here. And I would just deny that. I would say that a piece of bread changing in myocardic suffering tissue with white blood cells, that's already supernatural. That's intrinsically supernatural. No physical laws of nature can make such a change. And so you don't need DNA testing to conclude to the supernatural reality of these miracles. And guys like Kelly Kurz and Stacy Tratzakos, when they criticize Eucharistic miracles, if you read their articles, they almost never talk about the myocardic tissue. They focus on the blood and they focus on DNA, but they don't respond to the central point, to the central argument, which is 5 times out of that 5, you get 5 myocardic tissues. That's the central argument, and they don't respond to this.
Why do you think that they focus more on the empirical and less on the appearance?
That's empirical. I would deny that it's not empirical, the myocardic tissue. That's clearly empirical.
Yeah. So do you think that an appearance test during your analysis is empirical? I mean, it is. You're right. Like it's we're seeing things with our eyes. But there's a difference between quantitative and qualitative results.
And
And
AB is not just appearance, right? AB testing,
oh,
that's
I
not just
agree.
appearance.
But
Yeah.
I thought
And
that you
myocardic
already
tissue,
agreed that
yeah.
because bacteria can produce the exact same anti-A and anti-B antigens, uh, that that's not really convincing.
Yeah, but I
Um,
responded to that in my rebuttal, and I showed that they did that for Egyptian mummy tissues. And if there was these kind of reactions with antigens A and B appearing like that, you would also expect to find many A/B testing on old Egyptian mummies. You don't find that.
we
You
do.
almost find O or A or things like that. But when you look at always Eucharistic miracles or the Shroud of Turin, Shroud of Oviedo, Tunic of Argentine, it's always 15 different tests, A, B, A, B, A, B. So in terms of probability, what is from a Bayesian perspective, what is the probability that you get A, B, A, B all the time, all the time? That's very improbable, statistically. Yeah.
The way that I look at the A/B thing is that getting A/B results. So in Dr. Serafini's book, he talks about the 1977 Israeli excavation of skeletons, where they found that like 55% of the Israelis from the first century, they all had AB blood type, which is obviously not true. Obviously. So Dr. Serafini acknowledges this problem in his book, that when you test samples and you get AB, does that tell you that it's definitely AB blood? No. What it tells you is that there are anti-A and anti-B antigens present in the sample, which can also be produced by bacteria.
Yeah, I agree
So
because
when we test
the,
the blood and it's failing certain tests, like it's failing like hematocrit or whatever, and then we are also finding anti-A and anti-B, to me that's pretty clear. It's like, oh well, that's a like to me that's a flashing beacon that
yeah, but
this
you're
is.
talking about Lanciano. This is the Lanciano case. I agree with you that this is not the most knockdown case for the AB blood, but Tixla in 2009, the tests were done. 2010, the more modern methods were used. Immunofluorescence, which is not the same as absorption elution that was used in the Lanciano case, and it's not susceptible to be more. I mean, the AB contamination. I think it's you prevent this more with the new method of immunofluorescence. And on the screen, I showed that they use like 5 different testing methods the different on the different samples, the shroud, the scrotum, the tunic, and the Lanciano and Tixla. It's not always one type of method. It's these 5 different methods on 15 different tests. They always land on AB. So of course, theoretically, I agree with you and Serafini that there could be a contamination exceptionally, but that this happens consistently without any exception, that's the argument. That's really solid. And again, the AB blood, even if there's no AB blood, I would still believe it only based on the first myocardic tissue. I mean, for me, the central argument is based on the myocardic tissue, the 5 times out of time. That's the most solid, in my opinion. So the AB is like, okay, that's bonus, but for me, it's not the central argument.
Yeah, so I think to me the histology is probably the least important thing to me. And the reason I say that is because it's just looking at a picture and then being like, yep, looks like muscle tissue to me. And this is probably the engineer in me who wants to see quantitative results, not just qualitative results. Especially when we know that these samples were prepared using the same stains that you would use if you were staining human heart tissue. So it's like these stains were prepared with the eosin and the whatever the other one is called. Those
There's Buenos
stains.
Aires. That's just Buenos Aires, right? That's not the 5 cases.
It's Buenos Aires and it's Lanciano. And the rest of them aren't specified, but those are the standard stains that you use. And especially because Dr. Ricardo Castellan Gomez prepared the slides himself. It's his company did for Buenos Aires. So I assume that he prepared the Tixla slides the same way. Again, I don't know because these results aren't published anywhere. Well, not published anywhere. They're published in like popular level books, which is like very frustrating. Especially because it seems to me like this could be very easily solved by just submitting new samples and actually going through labs like Thermo Fisher Scientific, Icon, Q Squared, LabCorp. I mean, there's a million different reputable, and
Yeah,
I
there is.
don't.
For Tixla, there's the PatMed publication. You have the official document I showed in my presentation. It has been officially published for Lanciano too in a scientific journal. So there have been official
Lanciano
scientific.
Lanciano was
Yeah,
published in the journal associated with the college that Dr. Lonely worked at, and he was the owner and editor of that journal. So it's not like it
yeah,
was.
but it's still a scientific reputable journal. Like it's a scientific journal with reputable authority, right?
I will give you this. Lanciano is my favorite among all five.
Oh,
Oh,
really?
and
Interesting.
that actually leads me to a question. So I'll ask you a question, but I'll answer it first. Um, let's assume so both you and I have to pick of those five. We have to pick one that we think is the most likely to be authentically a miracle and one that is least likely to be a miracle, or as in the one that is most likely inauthentic. So I'll go first, and I'll say that I think that the most likely to be authentic is Lanciano, and the reason why I say that is because I think that the science, oddly, the oldest one I think does the best job in terms of actually like doing science, quote unquote. Um, I'm very impressed with Dr. Lonely, especially considering that the year was 1971. I mean, like the modern scientific process, people like to think about it as something that has been around since the Enlightenment, and that's really not the case. So I think that for the time, it was excellent, and even by modern standards, I still think it's better than the rest, if I'm being honest. So Lanciano is my favorite, and the one that I think that is most likely to be inauthentic is tough for me because so I'm going to give like a dual answer. And on the one hand, I think that Buenos Aires just has so much stuff published about it. Um, and so there's more stuff for me to pick on, you know? So maybe I can say Buenos Aires because I can like pick on things because things were actually made public about it. But then I could point to a different Eucharistic miracle like Sokolka, and I could just say something like, look, like nothing was released about Sokolka, like very little. They didn't even do blood typing at Sokolka. It was literally just two scientists looked at it under a slide and both said, yep, looks like heart tissue to me. And
You have
that's
the
it.
picture. Yeah, you have the
Yeah, yeah,
picture of the myocardic tissue intertwined with the bread, and that's scientifically it would be impossible to have a degree of microscopic interpenetration of the two substances. And so you still have the picture. I mean, it needs
right.
to be
But that's
accounted
all
for.
we have is a picture for like
And the
there's
testimonies of the two independent scientists who have like 200 publications on PubMed and who are
right.
very, very reputable in their domain, right?
But all they did was look at pictures. They didn't.
Under the
They're
microscopes. No, no, they looked
correct.
under the microscope, things like
That's
that.
what
And
histology
I mean,
is.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty reliable that these experts can distinguish bacterial contamination from a suffering myocardic heart tissue. Yeah.
Um, they did no actual testing. They just looked at images under a microscope. Um,
Yeah,
and so,
I think that's sufficient to recognize it for experts like this. I mean, if they had any doubt about the nature of this thing, they would have done more tests. But these experts judged its sufficient to have a look at it under the microscope. And I think that if these experts in their domain judged it sufficient, I think we should trust the experts. I mean, they have almost 200 publications on PubMed uh, combined. They're better than you and me on this stuff. So
oh, agreed. I'm
I
not a
think,
histologist.
yeah,
Yeah. And just to be clear to the audience, I do work in clinical trials, but I'm on the operations side. So like, I don't even like do science. I'm not a scientist. I'm an engineer. So I do work in the pharma space, but I'm on the ops side. So I'm not a scientist, and don't take me for one. But that's my answer. Buenos Aires / Sokolka. for different reasons, are the ones that I think are least likely to be authentic. I'm interested in hearing your opinion. Which one do you think is most likely and least likely to be authentic?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Probably the most likely. I mean, I think all five cases are pretty solid for different reasons, as explained in my presentation. Probably the one that's the most solid in terms of the science and things like that. Um, Maybe it would be Lignica, but I don't have access to the official publication. But I would say, well, Lignica in terms of rigor, I mean, they had 15 different samples. They had control samples, um, and uh, um, and they sent it to two different Polish universities. So that's very solid. But also, I would say, in terms of published results, Tixla is very, very impressive because you have many different laboratories in different countries studying it, blind testing, and yeah, it's just very impressive. They could also show the blood came from inside the host, which would be impossible in principle to fake. So Tixla to me is extremely convincing. I would say that also Tixla confirms Buenos Aires indirectly because what you find in Tixla is exactly what you found in Buenos Aires. 3 years later, after being in water, you find the white cells. That's confirmed in Tixla. So I would say that Tixla gives a posteriori confirmation of what happened in Buenos Aires. So even if you have some doubts about Buenos Aires, about the doctors before Zugibe studying it, what Zugibe sees in Buenos Aires is a posteriori confirmed in Tixla in Mexico, so in a different countries a few years later by different doctors. So that gives it more credence. In terms of the less attested, I would say maybe because of the time, the scientific methods at the time, Lanciano, but I still think Lanciano is very solid for the science at the time. And as I said, many skeptics object by saying, "Oh, it's from the first document is 16th century," but I think we can both agree that even if the miracle occurred in the 1500s, that would be still incredible preservation, and this would not affect the scientific analysis of Linoli. And so I would say perhaps Lanciano is the weakest because there was no blind testing. Okay, it's the only case where there was no blind testing. But still, I mean, Linoli is a reputable scientist, and it was confirmed by Roberto Bertelli in 1971. So Linoli was not completely alone in this. So yeah, I would say Lanciano, even though I think for the reasons I explained in my presentation, Lanciano is a pretty solid case.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Um, I'm currently logging into my computer just to make sure that I have no meetings directly at 8 o'clock because I have two topics that I was hoping to get to, and we'll see if we can get to both. I want to give you the option on which one you'd rather talk about. Um, the first is DNA, in particular, the cloning like the cloning concerns that you mentioned around the 46-minute 30-second mark in your opening statement. And then the second thing that I want to talk about is the mystic Katia Rivas, who you referred to in your opening statement as the or I might be misquoting you, false mystic or something like that. I want to talk about Katia Rivas, and I also want to talk about DNA in general. Do you have a preference which one we go to first?
I don't have any preference. I could talk quickly about Katia Rivas. I would say that even if one were to make the case that Katia Rivas is a false mystic, just to be clear, I haven't studied her case. I have no idea if she's a real or a false mystic. So I just want to put that aside. If you're really convinced that she's a false mystic, I would say that this has absolutely no influence under the scientific analysis because the guy who she influenced, Katia Rivas, were Ron Tesoriero, Ricardo Castañón Gomez, and Mike Wilsey. And so even if you were to grant that these guys were influenced by the false mystic, um, that won't change anything about the scientific studies that were done because these were not the scientists. The scientists who studied Buenos Aires, Zugibe had no link with Katia Rivas, neither did Dr. Lawrence have any link with Katia Rivas. And so I would say that although, of course, it's it's damageable for the reputation of the investigators. I don't think ultimately that this affects the scientific aspects of the case because you still have Zugibe under the microscope who's being filmed directly. So you have the direct filmed evidence of Zugibe studying the miracle, and you have his 2005 letter. And so that to me over outweighs the negative a prioris of Katia Rivas, who has no bearing on the scientific analysis.
I'm going to both agree, but then disagree with what you said. Agree. Katia Rivas has no impact. I doubt that people like Dr. Zugaba, Dr. Lawrence, I doubt that they even knew who Katia Rivas was. I don't think that Katia Rivas influenced Dr. Zugaba or Dr. Lawrence or any of the other in any way. However, I do think that Dr. Castellan Gomez is a firm believer in Katia Rivas. And the reason I say that, and Ron Tesorero, in Ron's book, and I wrote down the quote. Here it is. It's from Ron's book, Reason to Believe, on page 89. He says, so here's a little quote from the book. Dr. Ricardo Castellan Gomez calls Ron Tesorero. And some weeks ago, Dr. Castellan Gomez confided, Katia spoke to me. She had a message from Jesus for me. Tell Ricardo I want him to take charge of this case. Through it, I want to bring dignity back to my altars. And then a little further on, Katia tells Dr. Castellan Gomez that Jesus has a plan for him. What plan? That we will do tests and show the results in a program that you will make so that this miracle will become known and reignite the faith of the people.
Yeah,
To
and I
me,
agree. This is an argument that you can use against Buenos Aires. I would just say it's not decisive because if even if you were to grant that Gomez was under the influence of her being a false mystic, that would only show that they have a preconceived bias that it must be a miracle. But even if they have their own biases, this is absolutely not going to influence what Zugibe sees under the microscope, and so there's no connection, no link with that.
again, I
So
agree.
yeah, yeah.
I agree that it doesn't influence Zugaba, but we have this testing into compliance concern where Dr. Castellan Gomez just kept on sending the sample out until he got an opinion that he wanted. It's like, I don't know if you ever, do you know any people who are convinced that they have a certain sickness and they probably don't, but they just keep on going to get to different doctors until they get the diagnosis that they want, because these people, like I forget what it's called, but they enjoy like the idea that they have this kind of illness or whatever. This happens all the time in the real world. And Dr. Castellan Gomez absolutely tested into compliance, which again, the FDA refers to as anti-scientific. And he did so because he thought that Jesus told him that he had an obligation to prove that this was a miracle. Like, oof, that seems like it's pretty problematic for
Yeah,
somebody who
but
wants to.
okay. So even suppose I'm Castellan Gomez, I'm convinced that Katia Rivas is a mystic and that it's a miracle, and I'm miracle. The fact I try to give it to different doctors, that's not going to magically.
Oh no, Matthew, I've lost you. I'm not
Can
sure
you
if the
hear me?
audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can.
So where did I cut?
Um, go back about 10 seconds. So just because somebody like Dr. Castellan Gomez might have been under the influence of Katia Rivas.
Yeah. So just because someone like Castellan Gomez might have been under the influence of Katia Rivas and he wanted to test different scientists into compliance, as you say, uh, that's not going to make a myocardic agonizing tissue appear under the microscope of
Agreed.
Zugibe. Even if there's a bias on part of Castellan Gomez, you can't just turn bacteria into um, um, heart tissue suffering from the left ventricle and with white blood cells. I mean, the influence of the false mystic doesn't make magically appear white blood cells under the microscope that must die in a few minutes or a few hours outside of the organism. So I would say that this is not a decisive objection against the Buenos Aires case. And
Let's
that
not
Castellan Gomez was not under the influence of Lanciano, Sokolka, Legnica, and you
agreed.
still find the same myocardic tissue results. So that's independent confirmation in different cases. So we must not forget that the argument is a cumulative case argument. From a Bayesian perspective, you take many independent events by independent scientists, and collectively that forms the cumulative case and makes the argument convincing, even though you can poke holes at this or this in a particular event.
I want to come back to that, but just real quick, we're saying like, look, we have this heart tissue that we're seeing on a histology slide. What we have is something that looks like heart tissue to certain experts, doesn't look like heart tissue to other experts, and is failing all of these tests that are empirical, that are quantitative. So for instance, we didn't find any of the standard human STRs. So as far as I'm concerned, that rules out it being human tissue, no matter what it is. So it might be animal heart, or it might be plant cells that kind of look like heart tissue, but it doesn't have any of the human STRs. So to me, that
that's for the Buenos Aires case, but Zugibe, so this only applies to Buenos Aires case, first of all, not the other four. And Zugibe, in this case, knows it's human heart because he can see the white blood cells, and you're not going to find this in animal hearts or things like that. And I think so. He sees specific characteristics of human heart under the microscope, and he would not confuse this with an animal heart. And even if it were an animal heart, that would still be a miracle because into an animal heart. I would say that that still does not explain your fungal bacterian contamination hypothesis.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't disagree that it would be crazy if it was like, for instance, the heart of a orangutan or something, like some non-human.
It would be a miracle, right? If you have bread that transfers into animal hearts, that would still be a miracle.
I agree. But I don't think it is an animal heart because none of the empirical tests are proving that it's muscle tissue.
To me, Zugibe is an empirical test. And Dr.
Looking
Lawrence
at a slide. It's not the same as actually finding STRs.
That's what he does when does autopsies. When you're a medical doctor, you do autopsies. You look at samples under the microscope. That's what he's done for 30 years of his career. So, I mean, he knows how to identify heart tissue in his domain of expertise. Or what you're saying amounts to saying that he's out of his domain of expertise because he's using a method, looking under a slide that is not sufficient to determine the identity of the material. That's calling into question his expertise. And he's been a forensic cardiologist and a pathologist for more than 30 years. So I think he has more expertise than you and me combined.
He certainly does. However, I don't think that I'm out of line to say that simply looking at a slide is not sufficient to identify no clinical study. So like if the company that I worked for tried to do this, where we had some unknown organ tissue and we just put it in front of a doctor and they're like, yep, looks like heart tissue, that would not be sufficient. Do
you grant that to him, to Zugibe, it was sufficient?
Oh yeah.
He thought it was sufficient. Okay, so that means that you're saying that you have more competence than Zugibe to determine what is sufficient in order to determine the identity of the sample, because Zugibe thought it was sufficient and he has 30 years of experience in autopsies and cardiology.
I mean, in the same way that I think that Dr. Zugibe was wrong, I think that you think that the other 5.5 scientists are wrong.
Because they have less expertise. They're not professional cardiologists in this forensic area. As I said in my rebuttal,
histopathologists.
They're not professional of the heart after heart attack, these
but
guys in Australia.
But a histopathologist is the expert that we should be consulting on a histology slide.
What?
So if we're looking, if we're trying to determine what organ something is, we should be going to histologists, right? Not medical examiners.
Yeah.
So I don't understand why people might think that Dr. Zugibe's opinion is more important. He was a medical examiner. Medical examiners do histology, but this was a medically prepared slide. And again, that's not to say that Dr. Zugibe didn't look at slides. I'm sure he did. But like histologists are the experts here. And Dr. John Walker and Dr. Lawrence, like, these were all histologists, right?
Yeah, but they were histologists, but they weren't specialists in the domain where Zugibe is the expert, and he's expert where the heart has where people have a heart attack, because that's what you see sometimes in autopsies, and they weren't looking at just a healthy heart. It might be easy to recognize a healthy heart, but when you have a heart that has suffered severe trauma, it may be hard to identify since it will lose its morphological character, its normal morphological characteristics that you find in a normal healthy heart tissue. And so Zugibe was the expert in that domain, but the other doctors weren't. And so that's why there was uncertainty before Zugibe, because they weren't experts in that domain, in the heart going through in the heart having undergone trauma, severe trauma.
I really just don't think that a medical examiner is a better option than a histologist for looking at a histology slide. Especially and this idea that the seventh opinion is just so happens to be the most authoritative and gives us the result that we want. After the
In terms
mystics
of
told
credential,
me it was my job.
yeah, in terms
It's
of
just such
credential,
a
it is
just
because
so story, you know?
in terms of pure credential, it is because Zugibe has 30 years of experience. He has 10,000 autopsies, so he sees the heart all the time. He's an expert on the heart, a world expert at the time. He was probably the world expert, living expert on the heart. And so instantly he can recognize heart tissue because that's what he sees all day long in his 10,000 autopsies through 30 years. So, of course, he has more credential and experience than all the other doctors who preceded him. I think that's undeniable, right?
What credentials and how long was Dr. Peter Ellis? How long was he practicing and what were his credentials? He was the one from the University of Sydney.
Yeah, that's a good question. I could try to ask Dr.
We should do
Serafini
that.
or other guys, but I
I have
think
another
he had
question for you.
no specific credential in cardiology and
What about
forensic
histology?
medicine. What?
What about histology? This is a histological slide, right?
Yeah, but a special kind of histology where the heart has undergone severe trauma and is has some unrecognizable aspects. So that's what Dr. Serafini explains in his book. It's
How
not a
about
normal heart tissue. Yeah.
how about Dr. Thomas Loy? How many years of experience does Dr. Thomas Loy have?
I don't know, but I'm prepared to bet he has less than Zugib. I'm prepared to bet that.
Okay. I legitimately don't know.
Yeah.
So you might
We
be
can ask.
right that he
That's interesting. That's
yeah.
interesting. We can ask. I'll
But
try
I
to ask
just
him.
the fact that you were so quick to say like, oh, Dr. Zuckerberg has more experience, when I don't know that to be the case, and I don't think that you
Well,
know it either.
from a Bayesian perspective, from a probabilistic perspective, it's going to be very hard to make it better than 30 years of experience and 10,000 autopsies. Um, I can bet on that. It's a probabilistic judgment, but I think no one will go over this 10,000 autopsies and 30 years experience.
I agree, but this sample didn't come from an autopsy, so I'm not sure why the number of autopsies we've looked at should matter.
Well, it looks like what he sees in autopsies, So,
Sure.
mm, yeah.
To a hammer, everything might look like a nail.
And again, this is just the Buenos Aires case. I mean, even if you're to grant all what you say here, that doesn't affect the 4 other independent
Agreed.
cases which come to
Agreed.
the same conclusion of myocardic tissue. So again, the cases confirm each other indirectly. And so you have to look at the totality of evidence, not just the Buenos Aires case, because they interconfirm themselves together.
I do want to push back on the idea that that they are interconfirming, but in the interest of time, do you mind if I ask you about the cloning concern from your
Sure,
opening
sure,
statement?
yeah, yeah.
So I previously said that the DNA would convince me. Like if they all have the same DNA and all these different labs, or like that would convince me. You brought up DNA in your opening statement, which everyone will be able to see once we stitch all these videos together. Around the 46-minute and 30-second mark. Oh, nope, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. That's not, it's around the 42-minute mark. You said something, and I'm going to paraphrase, and I want you to correct me if I'm misrepresenting you. But you said something to the effect that God might not want to share Jesus's DNA because that it could be dangerous. For instance, people might try to clone Jesus and excuse me, and God wouldn't want people to clone Jesus Therefore, God doesn't allow anybody to detect any human DNA in these Eucharistic miracles. I have two points here. And the first is that, sure, maybe this is the case. I could grant that. But God could still allow us to find the 20 standard human STRs. And we didn't. Because don't forget that an STR is it's a sequence of base pairs that all humans share. So that's just how we identify DNA as being human DNA. And we didn't find any of those not in the numbers that we would need to find them if the sample was human, for any of the Eucharistic miracles. And we could have, and we still wouldn't have Jesus's full genome. We would just know that this is human tissue. But we didn't. So why do you think that God wouldn't even let us find the human STRs? And then secondly, couldn't God let us have found Jesus's DNA, but then couldn't he miraculously intervene to just make any attempt to clone Jesus fail? So you try to clone Jesus, but the cells just kind of like fall apart before you're able to inject them with Jesus's DNA or something like that. And like,
Yeah,
so I'm just curious to get your thoughts there.
I would say, sure, God can do that, but that's like saying, why doesn't God stop people falling from their house and stop the laws of gravities when someone is going to jump? That's the same question than saying, why doesn't God stop people trying to clone Jesus if they have access to his DNA? I mean, it would be weird if he did that, like the guy trying to clone Jesus and his hand cannot move or the cells cannot work. I mean, of course it's possible because God in Christian theology is omnipotent, he's all powerful, but it's not plausible to think he would do such a thing. And I would say the response would be analogous to what Christians have to say in The Problem of Evil. It's skeptical theism, so we don't know the reasons God would have to reveal or not Christ's DNA. Maybe God has good reasons we are not aware about for not revealing his DNA. I just gave a possible explanation. The possible explanation is cloning. I'm not saying that this is the absolute definitive reason why God doesn't want to do it. It's just a possible explanation, just like I can give a possible explanation why God permits evil in this and this circumstance, but no definitive judgment. And I would say that the DNA would be another proof of the truth of the miracle if it were true. However, I deny that it is a necessary condition to conclude that it's supernatural in nature, because as I said, my main arguments were the 5 myocardic tissues, and each time the blood was tested was AB. So myocardic tissue and AB, to me, these are the central arguments that the skeptic has to deal with. DNA is like, if we have it, it would be good, even better, but we don't have it, it's okay. We still have supernatural, we can still establish the supernatural without it. I mean, I think it's to be too demanding to be like to ask God to reveal the genetic code of Christ as if bread spontaneously turning into suffering myocardic tissues with white living blood cells wasn't enough for the skeptic. I mean, if that's not enough for the skeptic, perhaps you could make a probabilistic judgment and say, well, the skeptic will never believe after all, because he could always say it's misidentification. If there were the DNA test, he would say it's misidentification or a fraud or things like that. I would say that the DNA, though, it's a good argument actually against the fraud hypothesis, because if it were a fraud, like in Tixla, you would see the genetic code from the heart this person came from, and you would know that you could establish it was a fraud. So the fact that you cannot read the DNA, that never occurs on human tissue, and that proves that it cannot be a fraud. So that actually the DNA stuff serves to confirm the case of the miraculous events, I would say, in Tixla, for example. It confirms that there's no fraud involved. That's what I would say.
I'm not sure that I understand the lack of DNA results confirming that there is no fraud, but regardless, I do agree. I don't think that there's fraud involved in any of these cases. I don't. I legitimately don't.
Then,
In
yeah,
in
that
in
that would be
almost
a good. Yeah, sorry. You want
I
to
was just gonna
continue
say,
or?
in legitimately all, like in all of the case, not all, but like at Buenos Aires, at Tixla, at Lanciano, there were blood tests that were negative that would have been really convenient to the people who want to promote this if they were positive, and they were negative, and they reported them. They're like, yeah, we didn't find hemoglobin when we thought we were going to find hemoglobin.
They found it
Um,
in Buenos Aires, 1992, because you
yes,
didn't talk
but
about the Dr. Sazot's report. They found blood. They found hemoglobin. They could
that
give
was
the
never
leukocyte
published,
formula.
right?
So
That was like the
it's
weird
published.
notes on the
It's signed.
no.
It's signed in 1995. The report in October 29th, 1995. I have it on my opening presentation from Dr. Sazot.
Right. I mean, one doctor did these results and signed a piece of paper. It was never published in like a journal article or anything like that. Right.
No, yeah, you can always ask for more. That's what I'm saying. You can
Yeah.
always say, "Oh, it has not
Yeah.
been," but it's cumulative. You have to take into account the cumulative aspect of the case, because you can always criticize this case of saying, "Oh, it's better if it was peer reviewed," or you can always make it better. I agree with you, but the question is it sufficient when you take the 5 cases cumulatively? That's the real question. And so, yeah, that's why. Because if you hold to the misidentification hypothesis, in my opening presentation, I read the quotes from Dr. Serafini, who said that this hypothesis was really indefensible because he said that's like saying that a pilot with 30 years experience were accused of being unable to distinguish a runaway from a potato field landing his plane. That's exactly what you're saying. If you say that all the scientists, different scientists throughout the world in different countries at different times, cannot distinguish bacteria, fungal contamination from a striated heart muscle tissue that is suffering from the left ventricle, I mean, that's saying these doctors are all stupid, right? That amounts to saying that. That's actually what Serafini says in his book, and I don't think it's credible, especially when you see the slides. It does not look like bacteria.
But you also think, I mean, I don't think that you think that the other 5.5 scientists are stupid, right?
But it's
Dr.
not the same
Thomas
kind.
Loy and
I
Dr.
explained it's not the same kind of misidentification because there's a huge difference in nature between bacterial contamination and human heart suffering tissue with white blood cells and the skin cells or something coming from the human body. That would be a less a difference of misidentification. And Dr. Lawrence also saw the white cells. So it's not Zugibe alone. Dr. Lawrence 4 years earlier saw the same white cell, living white cell. So it's confirming what Zugibe saw. So it's not the same kind of misidentification from the Australian doctors in the 2000s, I would say. It's not as radical, you know.
It just seems very just so to me to be like, if you misidentify it, then you're accusing these scientists of being stupid.
No,
But
I'm
when,
just
I
accusing them
think
of
that
not being. I'm
we
saying
both
that these
think that
scientists.
various scientists have misidentified it, right? Because they can't all be right.
Reason the reason I'm saying that is that they are not expert in forensic pathology and cardiology, especially when the heart has suffered severe trauma because it loses its morphological aspects. And only a heart expert like Zugibe can distinguish that because it's something tough to see when you're not an expert in this field. And these scientists were not expert in this specific field. Whereas any scientist, and as Dr. Serafini, any scientist in the first year of medical school can distinguish bacteria from any human tissue because that's very easy to distinguish, right? So,
I mean, the first lab that they sent it to was a forensic lab, forensic analytical in Hayward, California.
mhm.
And that was the one that said no known morphological characteristics. So there we have a forensic lab and forensics, just like Dr. Zuguba. Are we to suspect that this company, this laboratory in California is just staffed full of, idiots? I don't think so. I just think that looking at a slide isn't the best way of telling what something is, and instead we should rely on quantitative tests, things like identifying human STRs or looking for organ specific biomarkers, things like that.
Yeah, I would say that if you take the five cases in general and you look at you use the argument of the forensic lab, okay, that's for just for Buenos Aires, but uh, take all the doctors from Lanciano, Buenos Aires, Sokolka, Tixla, Legnica, all the different laboratories at different times, at different places, all come to the same conclusion. That in itself seems to me statistically miraculous if they were all mistaking about this being a bacterial contamination. I mean, that's quantitatively and qualitatively, it's very different. It's compensates the objection you brought up about the forensic lab, which is one lab in California for the Buenos Aires case. So I think we should take all the evidence into account, not just a specific point to criticize.
Okay. Um, I am running out of time. But
No,
I asked virtually all the questions, so I want to make sure that I give you at least a few more minutes worth of questions to pepper me with. Um, if you have them, Matthew, and if you don't, and if you have to run, just let me know. But I've been doing like so much more of the questioning than you have, so I want to make sure that I try to share
yeah.
it a little bit.
No, actually, you've answered my main questions. My main questions was, are you going to defend the misidentification or the fraud hypothesis? Personally, I think that if I were an atheist, I would be forced to defend the fraud hypothesis because I think that the misidentification hypothesis has no credibility to it, as Serafini says in his book, with the quote I gave in the presentation. But as I explained in my presentation for each of the five cases, it's very, very difficult to hold that a fraud has have been happening in each of the five cases. So I think that Eucharistic miracles serve, from a Bayesian perspective, cumulatively as a good case for the truth of apostolic Christianity and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and that yeah, honest seeking skeptics should be able to see there's good evidence here, and maybe who knows, we'll get even better evidence in the following years because it's not going to stop. We're going to have others labs and scientific documentation in the following years. So maybe we could bolster the case with even more than five, and that would be very, very good. So I can't wait to see what God has planned in the future years.
Me too. I eagerly look forward to the next one that happens. Uh, and and hey, I'm optimistic that Dr. Kelly Kierce is pushing for some kind of protocol to be put in place. I think the Vatican could do this. They could put into effect some kind of like hey, look, these are the standards that we want you to do whenever there's a new Eucharistic miracle. Use these two labs, use these two methods, make sure that you don't just do blood typing, but make sure that you look for do genetic sequencing, do a full blood chemistry panel, do hematology. I think that'd be awesome. And I think that thanks in large part to you, Matthew, and to people like Dr. Serafini, more conversations are being had today about this topic. And I think that's going to allow the scientific rigor to only improve moving into the future. So I'm optimistic and eagerly awaiting the next one.
Careful, you're gonna end up converting it.
Well, hey, time will tell. Um, Matthew, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I had an awesome conversation with you. I To everybody who's listening, we exchanged our opening statements before this. We're going to stitch them into one video. And then the whole debate with our opening statements plus this live stream is going to be posted to Matthew's channel. So make sure that you go over to Matthew's channel to see the full debate. Matthew, where is your channel? Where can we find you?
So my channel is Matthieu Lavagna on YouTube. I'm a French Catholic apologist, so my videos are in French, and so maybe the American audience won't be able to understand it. But so you can put this debate on your channel. Maybe more people will be able to understand it because if I put it on my channel, I think like maybe 5% will be able to understand English. Yeah, so no problem.
Um, that sounds great. And I just want to let the audience know that I watch a lot of Matthew's content, and I just go to the closed captions and I do the auto translate to English, and then YouTube translates Matthew's French content directly into English for me, and I just read along, and it works great. So don't not watch Matthieu's content just because you don't speak French. I don't speak a lick of French, and I watch it. So I want to encourage everybody to go subscribe to Matthieu, watch his content, put on the subtitles. YouTube does a great job. And Matthieu and I may also wind up doing some future conversations, not necessarily about Eucharistic miracles, but remind me, what did we talk about? We had a couple.
Maybe Fatima, Lord,
Yes.
Zaytun, and sexual ethics, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. So stay tuned for that. Matthieu, thanks again. This was a blast.
Thank you. Thank you for so much for inviting me on your channel. And God bless everyone.
All right, everybody. Be good, and we will see you next time.
See you.